Hi, welcome to this series of videos on iZotope Ozone. Ozone is a plugin that includes 7 key tools that are useful for mastering music. You'll see them right here, and you can easily switch between them on the user interface for Ozone. The first 6 are the paragraphic equalizer, a mastering reverb, an important loudness maximizer, 3 multiband tools, the harmonic exciter, dynamics, and stereo imaging. In addition, there's a very well-designed dithering tool when you're converting from 24 bits to 16 bits for CD production. We're going to go over all of this and how you apply it to mastering. Now, in the course of these videos, we'll be using Pro Tools 9 as the host application, but you can use any application that you prefer, and the concepts will still apply. So now I'd like to introduce the music we're going to use in the examples in the course of this video series. The first song is Bombing the Fire by Cavalier King.
Dancer in a cage, I'm coming in the club, I'm gonna save another stranger. I need you to listen though, you and me in Mexico, riding on my rocket, we need oxygen and ethanol. I'm an outsider, seeker and a finder, got a little cut, I'm gonna open it up wider. Already we're closer, want it on a poster, you look a little feverish, so take another dose because the battle we are fighting and the reason why I wanna cut you out of all the lies that we're running out of time. Bombing the fire, you can change your life.
Great tune, and we'll have a lot of fun working with this song. Now the next song is Martha Berner, Fool's Fantasy, from her album also called Fool's Fantasy. So let's listen to that.
Oh, what a thing to say. I would shoot the moon, but my gambles never pay. I would take my time and walk this world with a friend of mine. Walk this world.
Another fantastic tune. So let's move on to the song from Johnny Gibb, the first one called Breakdown. Another cool song, and what I really like about the songs is that we've got a great variety. We've got one more song here by Johnny. Let's take a listen.
Just a few. 6 a.m. and I'm still without you, but I'm alive.
And next we have the song Marry Him by The Hawthorne Effect.
Hello, Chicago, here we go again. Standing up in a funeral for a friend. it's all come on right back again. I know she don't want to marry him. He's not her love, he's not a friend.
So that's the music we're going to use. I'd like to thank Scott Fritz from Stranded on a Planet Productions for hooking me up with the song from Cavalier King, Martha Burner, and The Hawthorne Effect, and also, of course, Johnny Gieb for providing his 2 songs for this project. So let's get started with learning Ozone, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over how to get around in the Ozone user interface. Now, if you look at the Ozone plugin, when you first come in, usually you'll see the preset management system. You can navigate the preset hierarchy. It's a normal folder structure, and a single click will select the preset for you. Also in Ozone 4, to the side here, we've got macro faders that allow you to go into some of the parameters and adjust them from these faders here. We'll cover that in detail in a later video. But one thing to realize is that a single click will select and set this up so you can play it back. It doesn't make it permanent until you hit OK, but it will allow you to audition different mastering presets on your track. And I'm going to demonstrate that right now by bringing up the volume so you can hear the music. So that's the basics of how you select presets. It's very nice, very quick to allow you to select a preset. One thing you might be tempted to do is double click these. If you do, you'll get into the renaming mode, which is probably not what you want to do. So once you've chosen a starting preset, then you click OK right here, and now we're ready to go in the project. We will cover the details of the whole preset system in another video. But for now, let's just talk about the way we get around in the rest of the user interface. This is the edit area, and for each major module that we have in Ozone, we have a separate customized edit window. Now we select which module we're going to look at by clicking on these buttons that turn red, showing which one is active at any point in time. So if I turn on the paragraphic equalizer, you'll also see that it's grayed out right now. That's because this module is bypassed. So I can either unbypass it right here in the edit window, or I can make it active by clicking this button here. So now we can see we've got an active paragraphic equalizer in our project, and we can start making EQ adjustments by graphically moving around within the window. And we can also turn these on or off right here. Now every one of these modules has a slider, and this allows you to do more or less of this effect from the starting point of the preset. So you can see that I've now made an adjustment to this EQ curve. If I want to emphasize that even more, I can turn that up, and it will proportionally increase the effectiveness of that, or make it more subtle if I go to the negative side. See, that actually makes that line go back flat, and each module has that. We can turn these back to the middle position by holding down the Option key and clicking on a Mac, or doing Alt-click with a PC. So if we wanted to move on and adjust mastering reverb, which is currently not active, we click the mastering reverb, we click active here, and now we can start to adjust the amount of reverb that we have on our track. Same thing with the loudness maximizer and these 3 multiband modules. Now moving along, let's take a look at the mastering meter section. You'll see that these meters appear on the screen no matter which one of these modules we have going at any one time. And the way the meters work is we have the meter, which is showing us basically an RMS level here and a peak level here, and then we've got faders to allow us to adjust the level. And this is the input level, and this is the output level. And it's color-coded in a way as you'd expect, with green, yellow, and then red if we overload or hit a peak. Now, We can control the input volume here, and you can see left and right are tied together. If we want to make an offset from that, we can unlock it with this button here, and now we can adjust the two sides separately. And then if we want to lock them back together, say our track's a little off balance, we can lock them back together, and now they'll move together again. You can also use an Option click on the Mac or an Alt click on the PC to set these to the default value, relock them, and then adjust it from there. Now the output section works just the same in that regard. We have an overall output level. We can lock or unlock, move the left and the right sides independently of each other if we wanted to. And then we can also Option click on the Mac to set them to the default value and then lock them back together if we want to do that. Now this range here shows the overall full-scale range in dB of our metering system. If we wanted to zoom in on the top portion of this to get a little magnified look, we can zoom in and out with these buttons right here. As you can see, I can zoom way into the top portion and have a little higher resolution look at what's going on with my meters. A right click on this meter section will open the I/O options. Now we're not going to get into great detail on this right now, but you can see that there's a variety of options for the ways to set up this meter. Right now it's set to an RMS peak meter, but we have RMS only, peak only, or K-system metering, and we'll get into those later. I would say for most part, RMS peak would be the most typical way that you would use this. Now the final thing that we've got here on the master section is this button here with the red and blue. This is for the mid-side processing mode. Several of these modules have mid-side processing. This was new in Ozone 4. This processing allows you to actually control what's happening in the middle of your mix separately from what's happening to either side of the mix. And this is a great capability that we have. Before, this was only available in very high-end mastering equipment, and now we have it available in the Ozone plugin. Now, to see what's happening with the mid side, you just engage this button, and there's a color code where red is mid and blue is side. So now we can see the relative impact, like our mid channel here is a little bit higher than our side channels, and this is probably what we would expect. But we can use this view along with our ears and our hearing to adjust the balance between mid and side processing. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn that off. Now the final area of the Ozone user interface is the global amount. We covered this in the introduction. This allows us to, once we've chosen a preset, to either do more of that type of processing or less of that type of processing. So if you're extremely in a hurry, then you can just pick a preset and then just tweak it with this one global amount. And it does definitely speed things up. You can also center that, again, using the Option click on the Mac or Alt click on the PC. Preset will simply pull up the preset list. And one thing to point out here is there is an option if you don't want to show presets on the startup. You can clear this, and then the preset manager won't always come up. And then finally, here's the bypass, so we can listen to what the difference is between using the plugin and bypassing the plugin. So with that introduction, you should have enough to be able to get around in the Ozone user interface and start applying processing to your songs. We'll be covering all the rest of the features in the upcoming videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the preset manager in Ozone. You open the preset manager with this button, and then you've got your list of presets. So we're going to go over all the different features of the preset manager so you can get an idea of how this works. Now, at the top, we've got the ability to sort the presets by these common sort orders. So if we have one of the preset lists open, then we can look at the last modified. So this would be the most recently modified or the last one that you used, which in this case is the Gentle Tube 3-band mastering. So ordinarily I leave this set unnamed, but these can also be very helpful when you get used to using Ozone and you want to come back to one of the presets you recently used. These are great features. Now the working settings allows you to return to the settings that you have set up in your Ozone instance before you start comparing it to presets. So if I go in here and click a preset, you'll see that my settings change immediately to that preset, but it's not permanent until I hit OK. So if I hit cancel, which closes the preset manager, then I go back to my original working settings. Alternatively, I can click right here on working settings, and that will take me back to my original settings before I started making changes. Now, iZotope has worked with professional engineers to come up with presets that cover a wide range of applications. Like for general purpose mastering, we have 4-band EQ and CD mastering and several other things that are related to general purpose mastering. And then we have things genre specific. So this is based on the style of music. There's presets for specific instruments, for post and broadcast functionality like dialogue and Foley. And there's special effects like a bad telephone effect or other locational type of effects that you can use Ozone for, not necessarily related to mastering, but the processors in Ozone lend themselves to using for a variety of purposes. There's also utility effects that emphasize certain modules in Ozone. Now, many of the presets in Ozone 4 have these macro faders, and these are the macro presets. You can create your own, or you can add to the macro faders that are in these presets using advanced functionality. We'll cover that at the end of this video, but for right now, as you look through the preset system, you'll see that there's a wide variety of useful presets. Double-clicking will allow you to rename a preset, and if you want to add your current working settings as a preset, you just click the Add button. You have the option to give it a name. And you can use certain characters, but you can't use every character. Very similar to file names. It will take common symbols, but not all. Things like backslashes or greater than, less than signs are not allowed. And so now I've got my preset that I've created of my own. I can also remove a preset using this button here, and it comes up with a dialog confirming I want to delete it. So I'll take that preset out. Also, if I'm working on a preset, I've made a few changes to that preset, and now I want to update it. I just click update, and now I've added those updates to the preset. Compare allows me to compare a current preset with my working settings. So I can click compare and then flip back and forth between those settings and my changed settings. A new folder allows me to create a new folder in this hierarchy. So if I've got my own custom presets that I want to organize into a folder, I can do that using the new folder right here. When you first start up Ozone, you'll always see the preset manager, but if you don't like that, you can click that to disable that. I actually kind of like to disable that because it's a little annoying to see the preset manager every time you open the instance for the first time. Now, an interesting capability of the preset manager is this section here on filtering. So if we go into, say, the gentle tube preset, we can load only a single module if we turn off these checkboxes here. Say we want to load only the reverb from the gentle tube setting. Then if we click the reverb, then we can use that. We can pull that into our working settings and then save that. And that allows us to combine the best elements of different presets if we would like. So if we've got things tweaked and we want to make sure when we go into another preset, we don't load things that are where we're going to lose what we've already done, then you can filter and then bring in only modules that you want to work on. There's also a shortcut here on these filters. Say we click on one where they're all pre-selected. If you hold on Option and click on the Mac, then you can choose a single module. Clicking it again will choose all modules. And that would be Alt on the PC and Option on the Mac. So Alt-click and I get reverb, and Alt-click again. Now if we have a couple of these unselected and we Alt-click, we get that. But if we Alt-click or Option-click again, you'll see that they're all selected. So that's how that toggle works. So now if we click on the Change Folder button, it allows us to change the location of where the presets are stored. If we actually look at the file system for this, you'll see that the presets are actually stored in a folder structure that matches the structure of the presets on the preset manager. And each preset is stored in a file with an XML extension. And we could copy these anywhere on our file system that we would like, and then navigate to that using this changed folder. We can also use that to reorganize presets. The presets files have the exact same names in them as they appear on the preset manager. And so it's a very flexible and easy to use system. It also makes it pretty easy to back these up or to copy them to another system if you want to use it on a different system. Now, if your computer is connected to the internet, the More Presets button will take you to a web page to allow you to download more presets. Users have contributed presets for Ozone to the system, and it pulls up this website when you hit that button that allows you to download different categories of additional presets for things that you can do with Ozone. Now, undock is an important feature that actually brings the UI for the preset manager into a separate window, and it's a resizable window, and you can make it full screen as you just saw there. If I make it full screen, or I can resize it with this handle. And it has a couple of nice things that you can do with this. One, you get a bigger screen to work with, and it also allows you to put this off to the side while you're trying out presets. So if you're trying out presets, you'll see that you can have it in a separate window. Another thing about the preset manager is it opens up the option of having the advanced options appear on the screen. So I'll go back to full screen on here. And the advanced options allow you to tweak or manipulate these macro faders. So if we wanted to add another macro fader or change the functions of any of the existing macro faders for one of the presets, it opens up a whole set of controls for that. You can see that this flatten EQ actually controls several gains, and you can go into all of the parameters within Ozone and bring them up to these controls. And you can also add your own additional macro faders, and that's done with this button here. I just added another macro fader. I could rename it. I can click a macro fader here and remove it. And there's a dialog box here that I need to approve to remove that. Now, I would say that setting up the macro faders and programming this is some advanced functionality that we won't be covering right now. So I'm going to go ahead and close the advanced button, but it's important to know that it's there. The other thing is that with the preset manager docked, the advanced function is not available. You actually have to undock it to get a bigger view and then use the manager there. As you saw before, I can also resize the macro fader editor and the normal preset selection screen. I can resize those with this bar here. So I'm going to go ahead and dock that back. And then finally, we have this question mark that pulls up the HTML help file. The HTML help file will load, and then you can navigate through that to answer any questions that you might have about the functionality of Ozone. So now we've covered all of the capabilities of the preset manager. You should have a good understanding about how to select presets, make changes to presets, or compare a preset or change to your working settings. We'll be using this as we go through the remaining videos, and you'll also use this extensively when you're using Ozone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. We're going to go over the common controls between the different modules in this video. We're going to start by looking at the options, but we're really focusing on this section of the user interface, and you'll see that as I flip through the different modules, that part stays the same no matter which screen I'm on. Now, we're going to go over all of these, but I'm going to start with the options, and we're going to go over what's on the General Options tab, because this will help you get set up, get the look set the way you want, and also get things like keyboard commands working. So in the graphics section, we can disable all the meters in Ozone with this option right here. We can show or not show tooltips, and we can enable animation. I'm going to show you what that means. For instance, if I go to the paragraphic equalizer and I'll click Show Info, you'll see that the info screen there slides in with a kind of an animation. Also, if I go and tab between controls or click on a control, you'll see that this white box indicates which control has focus. You'll see there's a bit of animation as you move from one to the next. So these two things control that. This will enable or disable the animation, and this shows or doesn't show the animated focus. I think those things are part of the look of the Ozone user interface. I'm going to leave them on. If you don't like them, you can turn them off right here. Also, Ozone has a background grid. If I go back to any of the modules, you'll see that there's a grid that is in the background on most of these things. You'll see the grid here. If we're in multiband dynamics, you'll see the grid showing through. Gives it kind of a unique look. Under Options on the General tab, you can turn that background grid on and off. If you have it off, then your overall UI is got a completely black background. And if you like that, you can turn that grid off. There's also kind of a shiny effect that you'll see that comes in and out along with that option. I'll leave that on. I think that's a part of the look. There's no reason to turn that off. Now, the frame rate limiter has to do with optimizing your CPU. If you're on a slower computer, you might want to turn this down. Your meters won't update as quickly. However, you'll conserve a little bit of CPU. For most modern computers, you can leave it at the default right in the middle here, and it will work fine. If you want a higher resolution, update it, you can increase this. Opacity is the ability to see through the user interface. So if you have the Ozone plugin over top of your tracks on your sequencer, you can see through it if you reduce the opacity, if it's supported. Now in Pro Tools that we're running right now, that option's not supported. That's why it's grayed out. But if you're running other hosts, you might be able to use this. Brightness controls the overall brightness of the UI. And I just will also leave that on the default. You can get back to the default on any of these sliders by holding down the Option key and clicking on the Mac, or you can hold down the Alt key and click with the PC. Dim controls when bypassed. Another option that I would leave set, if we look at, let's take a look at the paragraphic equalizer and bypass it, you'll see that the window looks gray. That gives you a good indication that this module is bypassed. And you'll also see that the bypass option, the checkbox here, it turns red. That can also be controlled in the next thing, which is solo bypass indicator solid red. You can also make these blink if you prefer. You'll see here's a blinking, which I don't like. Or you can have them look like a normal option. And they're just green. But the way I like to use that is solid red. Now, moving on through the general options, the host delay compensation, this allows you to enable or disable Ozone reporting its internal system delay. And so we're going to leave this option turned on for the most part because your host needs to know this information. And then the next option is low latency RTOS processing. Right now, RTOS means that we're in Pro Tools. If we turn this on, it will increase the use of CPU, but it will reduce the latency. Now, if you're tracking or you're using Ozone on a track, you might want to use this, but for mastering purposes, we're not so concerned about the latency. We really want optimum performance. So I'm going to leave this turned off. If I was recording while using Ozone as a plugin on a track, then I might want to lower the latency, and then I'd turn this back on. We can also view buffers. These are reported by the host, and we can also here look at the host sync, which gives us a lot of information that's reported back by the host. This is really diagnostic information that you probably rarely need to look at. Now, other important things here is the history depth. One of the reasons I want to go through this first is we need to take a look at the history depth and the keyboard support. History is the undo history, and 100 is a perfectly acceptable setting for most applications. And keyboard support has the option of none, meaning this is for keyboard shortcuts. And we're going to go over keyboard shortcuts next, and so I wanted to make sure that we have this set on full. If you have them set to minimal, the only thing that will work is the tab key, the arrow key, and the enter key, which does allow you to navigate around through the UI. But if you want to do any other hotkeys, that's not enough. So I'm going to put this on full for our demonstrations. If you don't plan to use any keyboard shortcuts, then you can turn them off altogether. Now, smooth global bypass transitions means when I hit this bypass button down here and bypass the effect, it will do a fade or a crossfade to bring the Ozone processing out as it brings normal processing back. And that gives you a nice smooth transition, which I think is a good feature. But if you don't mind having an abrupt transition when you hit bypass, you can turn that off. And solo side channel in mono, sometimes it's useful to solo the side channel in mono because there is a reversal of the channels when you go to the side channels by themselves. We're going to talk about that later on, and for now we'll leave that option set to off. So with those set up, we're going to go back through and go over what these other ones do. I'm going to unbypass this. Now reset on any module takes you back to pretty much a neutral setting, and you'll see right here I've got a room reverb that's set up in this particular module. If I hit reset, you'll see it went to 100% dry and 0% wet, basically neutralizing that plugin or taking you back to a common starting point for the plugin. You'll see this on every one of these modules. Now the history button brings up the undo history. Now we made a bunch of option changes. Anything that we do in Ozone gets tracked, and as we saw before, I've got this set to 100 depth, so I can go back 100 steps in Ozone and undo. Now let's go to this module, and I'm going to make a few changes. So I'm going to increase this delay on band 1, 2, and then 3. And now we're going to look at the history, and you can see that I made those changes. Now if I click here, it will undo the first one, the second one, or it'll even go all the way back to where I changed other modules. Now, if I want to compare these different settings against my music, I have a really cool thing that I can create these views by clicking on these buttons. So I'm going to create an A by hitting set here, a B hitting set here, and a C hitting set here. And this allows me, no matter where I set these up from within the history list, to quickly jump to those settings. So if you're trying to decide on some different options, then you can set these in the history and then jump and get a way to do comparisons. So these are the comparison presets. Now, another thing I wanted to point out is that we can use the keyboard commands, and on just like any other program, Control Z is undo. So if I hit undo, you'll see that I can, let me just do these changes again here. So I'm going to set this here, and this here. And now I'm going to do Control Z 3 times. You'll see I can walk back. That would be Command Z on a Mac. And then I'm going to do Command Y, and I can walk back through those changes, or Control Y on a PC. The other thing you'll notice is that the faders allow you to click into the fader where you want it set, or you can grab the thumb of the fader and move it up and down. And another really interesting observation, the user interface of Ozone is all sliders, faders, and values. There are no knobs. There's no attempt here to look like vintage gear with knobs. It doesn't look like a Pultec or like an LA2A. It has its own look that, if anything, it looks like something out of the movie The Matrix. Now, moving along, we have the solo button. On every channel, we can solo, and then that will temporarily bypass all the other channels. Alternatively, we can bypass so we can hear what it's like to take this particular effect out of the chain. And we also have the graph. Graph allows us to change the order of the effects. Normally they're set up in this order where EQ is first, followed by reverb, these multiband processors, and then the loudness maximizer, and then these are metering. Now, if you wanted to, you can change the order to some extent, like you could put EQ ahead of reverb, or within the multiband processing, if you wanted to do stereo imaging ahead of the exciter, you can drag these around. This is new functionality. These used to be fixed within Ozone, but it gives you a great deal of flexibility, especially if you want to use Ozone for creative sound design purposes. So that's the graph. Options we already looked at. Options has a general tab that we've completely covered now, but there's also tabs that could cover a variety of other things, and we'll cover those when we get to those topics. Now, there's a few other keyboard shortcuts that you should be aware of. If we have the option set to full keyboard support, then we can also do shortcuts into these modules using the number keys along the top edge of the keyboard. So if I hold down Command on a Mac and hit 1 and then 2, you'll see it goes to the mastering reverb and then the loudness maximizer as I go up through the numbers. And this would be holding down Control on a PC and hitting numbers 1 through 6. So that might be helpful. I normally just click directly on them. Also, the Ozone plugin has to have the focus for that to work. If your focus is back on your DAW system, then that won't actually happen. Same thing with presets. I can use Command P on a Mac or Control P on a PC to pull up the preset screen, and also the global bypass is B, Control B or Command B for the global bypass. Now, one more thing, if you want to move around between controls on screen using the keyboard, you can use the Tab key, as you see right here, to move between controls. And then you can use the Shift tab to move backwards through controls. You can also adjust the value using the arrow keys. So if this is a way you'd like to work, it's an option. And I would say it's pretty nice here because it's consistent with other programs that you're likely to have used in the Mac and Windows world. And finally, we've got Help. Help pulls up an HTML help file that allows you to answer any questions you might have about Ozone, and you can search into this help quite effectively, and I would say it's a fairly nice help system that Ozone has. So now we've covered the common controls and the general options for Ozone. You should have a good understanding as we move into the functionality of each of the individual modules in the coming videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to cover the paragraphic equalizer module in Ozone. Now, the paragraphic equalizer is really a parametric equalizer, much as you've probably experienced in your digital audio workstation. If you look at the screen, we've got up to 8 different bands of parametric EQ, and you can graphically manipulate this. This isn't that unusual, I think, for modern software. You can also change the Q value or the bandwidth of each node by manipulating these handles. And you get on-screen indications of the values as you move these around. So you can do subtle or dramatic boosts, you can do shallow moves, or you can do very tight peaks in these moves. This sort of thing is useful as you're trying to narrow in on frequency bands. Another interesting thing is with a keyboard shortcut, by holding down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC, if you click on a node, it will actually solo that node out, as you can see. I'm going to play it back a little bit of the Cavalier King track.
I need you to listen though, you and me in Mexico, riding on my rocket, we need oxygen and love.
That gives you an idea of how that works when you solo those out. You can also click on one and then hold down Command if you're on a Mac or Control on a PC. And now I've selected 2, and I can then move 2 of these nodes together. And that's pretty much how the user interface works for the paragraphic equalizer, for the parametric part of it. We have a nice reference here for the frequency, and you can see on screen that you can also see the dB and the hertz, or the frequency, wherever you're pointing the mouse. That sort of follows you around. Now, to get into more details about this parametric equalizer, we can hit Show Info, and that brings up a full list of parameters. From here, for each node, as they're numbered here, 1 through 8, I can enable or disable these different bands. And I can also choose the shape of the filter. You can see that currently, for number 1, we've got a high-pass filter, and on number 8, we've got a low shelf filter. These would be pretty typical settings, but let's just take a look here. We've also got a high shelf filter, a low pass filter, a high pass filter, and a bell. So typically in the middle, you'd use these bells, and on the low end, you use a high pass, and on the high end, you use either a low shelf or a low pass filter. So I'm going to leave it set like this. Now, also within here, we have the frequency, the dB of boost or cut, and the Q setting. You can also drag up and down here, or you can, as I showed before, drag these handles to set the frequency response. Now this filter sounds really good, but it's actually got 2 completely different settings, as you'll see here. Here we've got a linear phase filter. So as you manipulate it, it's very accurate and very transparent in what it does. It doesn't do things like vintage outboard gear would do because it doesn't mess with the phasing. There isn't overshoot on the filters like you would typically see, say, on a high-pass filter. So I'm going to show you about that with this setting right here. But first of all, I do want to mention snapshots. Snapshots allow you to take snapshots of the frequency spectrum range. As I play back, you'll see that frequency spectrum superimposed over the parametric equalizer. And that is why it's called a paragraphic equalizer, because we've got that graphic view. I want to point out that snapshots is open and closed by clicking on this button. So if you wind up with this screen here stuck open, you just click it again and that will go away. We're going to cover snapshots and frequency matching in a separate video because it's a topic that's worthy of its own video. But now moving along here, this is the setting that sets the characteristic of this filter. So it's almost like two completely different sets of filters. We've got the digital one, the matching one, which we'll cover in the other video, and analog. So even though Ozone doesn't look like vintage gear, when you kick in the analog mode, it does give you a lot of the characteristics of tube-based equalizers. And you'll see right here, immediately, as soon as I kick that in, as I tweak this cutoff frequency of a high-pass filter, you can see that we get overshoot that gives you a resonant peak. And that sort of thing happens. You can also see it actually cutting the highs. There's a resonant peak where it's actually boosting the highs above that point. If we're in the digital version of this filter, it doesn't do that at all. So if you want to get some of that analog character, then you can click in this. And this button is the zoom. This zooms in the magnification, as you can see, around the main area of the screen that you need for setting your frequency response. You can go backwards through these settings by using the control key as you click back, and I believe that works the same on Mac and PC. Now moving along to the stereo button here, I'm going to just hide this. These are the mid-side controls, and in this video series, this is the first time we've encountered the mid-side controls. If we are in stereo mode, then this applies to the center phantom image as well as what's on the stereo spectrum on each channel. If we go into this mid-side mode, we can now manipulate the frequency response of the middle part of the signal separately from the sides. So the best thing to do is just to demonstrate this. I'm also going to point out that this is a bypass and a solo for the mid-band. And so I'm going to play back a little bit more of Cavalier King, and I'll just do a few frequency response manipulations here so you can kind of hear what it sounds like when we're working on only in the mid-band. Now this bypass bypasses the effect, but solo actually will solo the mid-band of the frequencies. This is extremely helpful. Let's do an example now where we activate the sideband. This is the curve we currently have for the sideband. So one of the things about working with the midband and the sideband, on the midband we can work on the bass and on the lead vocal or lead instrument to bring it forward in the mix if necessary, and we can isolate it by moving around with these bands to really find, where the key frequencies are that we want to work with. Now with the sideband, we can take things that are in the stereo image and maybe brighten it up slightly or find key frequencies for instruments to help improve stereo imaging. Of course, normally in mastering we use these things pretty subtly, but this is fantastic tools, and these are things that previously were not available in the box or on the desktop type of mastering. Now, a couple of other things we can use to work with mid and side. One, we can couple them together with this button here. That will link the mid and side together, so manipulations will now affect both. The other thing is you can copy your setting from one. So say you had the mid band set up perfectly, you want to apply it to the side band. If you right click here, you can now copy to side channel. So if I click that now, I've kind of reset them both to the same position, and now I can manipulate that from here. So I think that you will find as you work with this is almost amazing tools that we've got to work with that give us capabilities we just didn't have before in mastering tools. And that's a new and fantastic feature of Ozone 4. So with that, we've covered the paragraphic equalizer. We didn't cover the spectrum display very much in this video, but when we go into the snapshots in the next video, and also frequency matching, which is an exciting feature, we'll cover it at that point. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue talking about the paragraphic equalizer and the spectrum display. We're going to look at the options for the spectrum display, and then we're going to apply that in the next video to the exciting matching capabilities of the paragraphic equalizer. So the way we get into the options for the display is to right-click right in the edit area while we're in the paragraphic equalizer. We can choose spectrum options from here, and this loads our options selected on the spectrum tab. Alternatively, we could always go into the options button at the bottom and then choose the spectrum tab, and it will show the same thing. So let's take a look at what these options do. Enable the spectrum EQ just enables or disables it. So if we're playing back our song, you'll see that with it enabled, it looks like this. But with it disabled, it basically takes it off the screen. Now, we normally would want to leave that enabled. However, you might conserve a little bit of CPU if you disabled it. Some people might also be maybe a little bit annoyed to see that jumping around, but for the most part, we'd leave that enabled. There's also a mini spectrum in several of the other modules, so I'll play back again and show you where those are. So you'll see that the mastering reverb and all of the other multi-band modules all have a mini spectrum display at the top. Now we can turn that off with this button right here if we want to take off the enable mini spectrum. Now the spectrum type defaults to linear, but you can also do third octave to give it more of a bar graph display, or critical, which is even a bigger bar graph display, and I'll demonstrate those right here. Now, both the third octave and the critical are very helpful views when you're working on EQ, because the critical organizes it by the way that human hearing works, and the third octave gives you more of an overview of the range of frequencies compared to the linear mode. But we will leave it in linear for the time being. Now, show peak hold allows you, let me get it playing in the background and then I'll turn the audio down. Now you'll see in the background here that with this mode, the peaks are held on to and then they fade out over time. And then the following option determines how long they're held. 500 milliseconds is the default, which works pretty well. But if you want them to hold on there longer, you can go all the way up to infinite, where they'll never go away. It looks kind of interesting when you go into linear mode as well. This shows you throughout the song the overall peak in those bands that basically are reached. But infinite's not nearly as useful, I don't think, as some of these other settings. So anyway, if you don't like that, if you do this, then you'll have this kind of a display that's much simpler. But on whole, peak hold is a very nice thing to have. 500 milliseconds is a reasonable setting. Now show the Hertz and dB readout. The Hertz and dB readout is right here in the corner. So as you move around with the mouse, then you'll see this. It shows you basically the frequency range in dB, the boost or cut level. It will also just show you as you point the mouse anywhere on the screen what those values are. And then we have the option to show musical units. This just superimposes the octaves onto this frequency map. Now, this section here is useful when we're doing captures using the snapshot functionality. Real time is what we've been looking at, where the frequency spectrum is basically captured in real time. But if we want to slow that down, we can start averaging it over a second or 3 seconds or 5 seconds, and then you'll see that it doesn't jump around so much. It just sort of achieves a steady state after a while. And if you go all the way up to 10 seconds, that movement slows down even more. And then if we go to infinite, during the playback time, it will just continue to build on that average. So there's very little movement. Now, when we're doing snapshots, either infinite or 10 seconds gives you a pretty good view of the frequency response of the material that you're playing. So this is important when we use this snapshot and the matching functionality that we'll be covering later. Now, window size is the number of samples that are used for the basically calculating the frequency response curve. And I think this 4096 is a reasonable value. There's probably no reason to change it, but you do have a few values here to choose from. Also, the overlap of the windows, the more you increase this, the more the CPU is taken. So 50% is probably a reasonable setting for this as well. I can't see really any reason to change that. So window, this is probably the tweakiest value in the entire Ozone system. It specifies which algorithm to use for calculating the window for the calculations for the frequency spectrum display. I can't see any reason not to leave it on the Han setting, but if you're into the science of digital signal processing, you can experiment with these other settings. You'll get virtually the same result no matter what you set this to. So now you should have a very good understanding of what your options are when you're looking at the spectrum display in the paragraphic equalizer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue talking about the paragraphic equalizer and how to use the matching EQ in the paragraphic equalizer. As we've seen before, there's 3 different kinds of equalizers that we can use: digital, analog, and matching. And we're going to go over in this video how to set up the matching EQ. And you do that by taking a snapshot of a reference song and applying the EQ of that to your song to match it. It's a very powerful starting point and certainly an educational tool as you work on mastering. So first of all, let's take a look at the screen and how you actually do a snapshot. And it's very simple. During playback, all you need to do is on one of these 8 buttons, click on the button during playback and you'll capture the frequency response curve at that point. So the spectrum is actually frozen. If I click it again, it resets that. So this purple one is the response of my song that I'm playing back right now. You can do that into all of these different registers. Now, I typically use the bottom row, E, F, G, and H, and use that to sample other professionally released music. And sometimes I can even use hit songs for that. And I'm going to show you how to set that up as well. Now, before we get into the matching EQ, let me just show you a couple other things on the screen, on the snapshot screen. There's preset snapshots like the 6 dB guide. If I turn this on, then you'll see it superimposes a 6 dB per octave roll-off curve. And generally, a well-balanced mix will roughly follow that type of a slope. Also, we have a pink guide, which is a 3 dB per octave curve. A little bit brighter sound. Some more modern music follows a little bit brighter path. But anyway, a modern, popular music mix would typically fall in this range. Actually, a mix of most kinds of music will typically follow the slope, where more modern pop music might be a little bit brighter. So you can show or hide anything that we've captured or these presets by just clicking in the Show button. So we'll turn this off as well. Now, using import and export, I can capture my reference tracks and then I can have them available no matter what song I'm mixing. So I'm going to show you how to do that using Pro Tools. So on my Pro Tools project, I set up a reference track. You don't need to do this in your actual mastering project. You can do it in a separate project ahead of time and have several reference tracks that you'd like to regularly reference. So I've now put an instance of Ozone on here, and I'm going to load that instance of Ozone. Got to make sure you're on the right one. Now we'll go into snapshots. I'm going to turn off any of the ones that I had going here. And now another thing before you capture from your reference material is you want to turn off all the modules other than the paragraphic equalizer. And on the paragraphic equalizer, you want to hit reset so it looks flat like this. You don't really want to do anything to the signal when you're capturing this. You want a completely neutral signal. And the reason is, if we look at the graph and the order of processing, the parametric EQ is right down here, but the spectrum module is all the way down here. So anything that's happening in here can affect our spectrum display. We want to capture it in a very neutral, unaffected way, so we want to bypass all the other modules. With that said, in the options, we talked about this before, I like to put the average time to 10 seconds before sampling the reference material. You could also put it on infinite. The reason I don't is it just takes a long time for the signal to recover before you can take another sample. With it on 10 seconds, it's, I think, the most usable. But anyway, you want this on 10 seconds or on infinite. And then we'll start playback of the reference material. So here's our reference graph, and we want to wait quite a few seconds for it to really stop fluctuating. And so now we've hit sort of a steady state. We'll go into snapshot, and I'll take my first snapshot. So that's the red graph. And I could actually take different parts of the song or different songs and take snapshots. I just took all four right here just so that we've filled up these registers. I'm going to use this blue one because I think it's the most visible on the screen. But anyway, with that done, I'm finished with taking my reference curves. So I can turn off playback, and you can see that that's starting to settle out again. And then in the snapshot feature, I'm going to export these settings. So all I need to do is go to the export, and then I'm going to do all snapshots. And this will put them in a file, which I call snapshot example, and it's saved with the other presets for Ozone. Or you could put it anywhere on your disk or on a USB key if you're going to go to another studio and you want to use these references. And now I'll close this instance of Ozone. Depending on your host depends on how one instance interacts with another instance, but just to be on the safe side, as I go to another instance, I'm going to load that file. So I'll go back to snapshots and import, and then this dialog, I'll say all snapshots, and I get the same thing here, and I'll do my snapshot example. I'll choose that, and now you'll see that I've got these available here in my song. All right, so next I'm going to sample my own song, and I want to make sure that the paragraphic equalizer is set to neutral, and I reset it, but I still see a little bit here, so what I'm going to do is turn off the high pass and the low pass. There we go. And now all I've got to do is play back. Again, I've bypassed all of the other modules in Ozone just to make sure we're focusing strictly on parametric EQ. And I'm going to get playback going. I've got my options set to 10 seconds, and then I'll capture a few samples of this song. All right, so I captured samples into the first three registers here. I'll just use the first one because I can hide or show any of these. So now I've got this white sample. This white sample shows my current track, and then the blue sample shows the reference track. And you can see already the trend, or generally the curve, is pretty close. The only real difference is that the reference track has maybe a little stronger mid-range, but you can see that the high end, it's a very good mix that we're working with to start off with. And the other thing is a reference track is just a reference track. It might not stylistically be quite right, but anyway, this is how you do this. Now that we've got both tracks ready to go, I'm going to choose the source track, which is my track, and then the target track, which is the commercially released song track. And now all I need to do is switch this to the matching mode, and already Ozone is trying to create a curve to do boosts and cuts to match the two songs together. So if I play back a little bit, I'm now going to show you the effect of manipulating the matching amount. So this is sort of like quantizing, where we're quantizing the overall EQ curve of a song to another one. The more that we turn this up, you'll see the more complex this line becomes. Ozone breaks this into 8,000 bands of frequencies, so this can do a tremendous amount of manipulation to the frequency response of your song. The other thing is that this shows how smooth or how sharp the curve is. So if we have this more smooth, then you'll take a look back here, we get a more subtle trend. If we have it more to 0 here, it's going to be completely sharp. So here, theoretically, this will make our song 100% match the source in its EQ curve. Now that might not sound good. It probably will sound fairly unnatural if we do it this way. The recommended amounts is somewhere less than 50% on this, and then this somewhere up near 50%. However, you really have to play around with this. Even once you have this set up, you can still manipulate this curve with the nodes that you've got on there. All right, so I'm going to do playback, and then you can get an idea. I'll also bypass this so that you can hear it affected and unaffected on this particular track.
Turn it up higher, really surrender free, 'cause we are bombing the fire. The battle we are fighting, and the reason why I wanna cut you out of all the lives that we're running out of time. Bombing the fire, you can change your life. Follow desire, that will rock your world. Bombing the fire, you can change your life. Follow desire, that will rock your world. Bombing the fire, you can change your life. Follow desire, that will rock your world. Bombing the fire, you can change your.
So there you go. That's how you use snapshots, and that's how you use the matching EQ. It can be a really powerful feature in Ozone. Some people will stay completely away from it. However, I think if anything, this is a tremendous educational tool. And if you apply it subtly, you can actually do a very nice job of setting up the paragraphic EQ. As you can see, a slight rise in the mid-range here, and then just very careful tapering. I would not overdo it using this, but it is a very powerful feature. A lot of people who use Ozone realize that this feature's here and never really learn how to use it. So now you should have a good understanding of how to use the snapshots in the paragraphic equalizer and how to use the matching EQ to match your song to a reference song. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the mastering reverb. This is a module that I've really enjoyed in Ozone, and allows you to tie together all the different elements of your mix with a little bit of reverb. The reverb is usually applied very subtly. This depends on the nature of the project. If you're working on a solo mix that is very dry, then you can bring some space into it. And otherwise, I've used this in situations where I'm doing compilation albums and I'm trying to get a common space to tie together all the different tracks on an album. You'll also find that in many presets for Ozone, the mastering reverb is not engaged. So it's really not essential that you apply mastering reverb to every single project, but where you need it, it's really, really handy. So let's just take a look at the screen for the mastering reverb. Starting at the top, we have the spectrum display. If I play back a little bit, I'm going to be using Martha Berner's Fool's Fantasy for the examples in this video. You'll see at the top of the screen, we have the mini spectrum display. And then this is the crossover frequency for where the reverb is applied. So basically, I have a roll off on the bass side and a roll off on the high side. And a lot of times for reverb, you'll roll off the bass anyway, somewhere between 50 and 80 or 100 hertz. And then the high side is also commonly rolled off above 7,000 hertz. And so you can adjust those here. You can also double click and type these numbers in directly if you want a really exact number for your cutoff frequency. And then the very first thing we see in the UI here is it's very easy to use with just 6 sliders. We also have this, which sets the algorithm between plate and room. And I would say whenever I've used this, I've always used the room algorithm. The reason to use the plate algorithm is because it consumes less CPU. Now I'm going to demonstrate the difference between these two algorithms. Before I do that, you can see that I've got this set to 100% dry and 0% wet. So you're not going to hear anything if I play back right now. We're going to start by listening to the room reverb. I'm going to put this to 50% on the wet control so that you will definitely hear some reverb on the song. And then as I play back, I'll switch back and forth between the room and the plate algorithms.
Carry this one. Fortune tell his lies.
Now, in reality, we'd never put this much reverb on for mastering purposes, but I just wanted to let you hear the difference between the two different algorithms. The room algorithm is definitely richer, and a plate is a mechanical simulation of a room. I would use that plate reverb in situations where I was using Ozone as a plugin on a lead vocal, perhaps, which is possible because you've got some great controls here. But for mastering purposes, I'd leave this on room. The only reason not to do that is if you really wanted to reverb and you had a very limited CPU. Room reverb takes a lot more CPU than the plate. With that said, let's go on to the other controls. These are pretty obvious. This is the dry signal. The vast majority of the time, you'd leave your dry signal set all the way up and then mix in a little bit of the wet signal. And for mastering purposes, usually we're putting in somewhere under 10% of a wet signal. So it's really usually fairly subtle. On the side channel, you might put a little bit more, and we'll be talking about that later. Now, this control here is to solo the reverb signal. So I'm going to put this back up a little bit. We'll play back again, and you can hear how this works. went more towards a more realistic setting. And you also saw there's a lot of glitching as you slide these things around. So I prefer to set these faders by just clicking into the settings. And with that, you should have a pretty good understanding of what these do in general. This is not difficult. Almost all reverbs that you've probably dealt with have similar controls, and probably a lot more on top of that. Now let's take a look at the mid-side processing, because that's where this gets really exciting. If we go into mid-side, we can separate the side channel, which is the mid channel is in orange and the side channel is in blue. That color code is throughout Ozone. But the really fun thing about this is that we can change the processing. So on the mid channel, we might want the reverb to be nothing. We might not want to add it, or we might want to add it extremely little of it to the mid channel, because we don't want to blur the sound, or we don't want to, change the intelligibility of the lead vocal or something like that. So we might want to leave this part completely off or very low. But on the side channel, we might want to bring in some more space. We can do this in a couple ways. One, by having the wet control up more on the side channel than on the mid channel. And we can also use the pre-delay a little bit more on the side channel than the mid channel. So with that set that way, let's play back.
Say I would shoot the moon. Oh, I would shoot the moon. Oh, I would shoot the moon. But my gambles never pay. Oh.
So it gives you a lot of ability to add a lot of space without actually changing the sound of the lead line in most songs. So I really like that quality of the mid-side, and this is a new feature that I've really enjoyed in Ozone 4. So the correlation meter, the phase meter, and the show channel ops, which gives you the mono switch and some other tools, we'll be covering these in a separate video on the mastering metering. So check for that if you're interested in what's going on here. These also appear in the multiband stereo imaging. Very, very useful tools when you're working with the stereo image. With that, we've covered pretty much what you need to know to operate the mastering reverb. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the loudness maximizer. A loudness maximizer is a specialized limiter that allows you to bring the overall perceived volume of your mix up. And if you apply only one thing to your mix to do mastering, it's probably going to be the loudness maximizer. And as a matter of fact, if you've got a great sounding mix, this is probably all you need. Now let's go over the controls for the loudness maximizer. On this side of the screen, this is all the controls that there are. Now we use this in conjunction with our input and output metering to make sure that nothing is clipping. These controls here are related to dithering, which would be typically used for bit conversion from 24 bits down to 16 bits for CDs. I've turned off the metering for this. We're going to just want to make sure that the dithering is set to type none in this box right here, because we're not going to do dithering or cover dithering in this video. We have a separate video that goes over the topic of dithering in more detail. But for volume maximizing, what we want to do is, without causing a lot of artifacts, we want to bring the loudness level up to be a competitive commercial sound. Now that, of course, depends on the intent that you have for your music, but in general, that's kind of the idea behind it. The other thing we want to do with loudness maximizing is make one track match the other tracks on an album. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how I might approach that after we go over the basic controls. So like any limiter, we have a threshold control where we can lower the threshold. Now you can lower it here, or you can actually grab it over here in this histogram view. Now I'm going to explain the histogram and then play a little music so you can see what it does. But basically, it shows you the level of your music, but then it also shows you over time a history of that level. So it gives you a histogram, and it gives you a pretty good idea of how far back you can pull the threshold before, I guess, you overdo it. So let's play back a little bit of music and you'll see what I mean. Now you see with that histogram, there's also this section here, which is gain reduction, like you'd see with other limiters or compressors. So the gain reduction comes in here. It also tells you how much. And then you've got the histogram to give you a guidance on how far you can bring this level down. In addition to that, we've got the makeup gain margin. So I have it set at minus 0.3 because I don't want to go any further than that in hitting my peak. You could set this at 0 and it will take your output level all the way up to 0. So as you pull down the threshold here, Ozone will automatically figure out the makeup gain up to, this is minus 0.3 dB. You could set this at minus 0.2 or even minus 0.1. I typically would not set that right at 0 because you might get clipping and playback on some systems. Now let's take a look down here. This control and this are related to the mode. So we're going to go over the modes and how they relate to these values that are set right here. And so let's just take a look what they are. We've got soft mode, brick wall, intelligent, and intelligent 2. Now soft would emulate an old style compressor or an analog type of mastering compressor. And as such, it will allow you to overshoot the margin as you bring it down. You can't get nearly the amount of volume maximizing out of this, but you will get a softer, more natural sound. And especially if you're doing a project where you're trying to emulate older music, like if you're trying to do a recreation or something in the style of a 60s band or 70s music, you might use this or the next one, which is the brick wall. So when I play the music back, you'll see as I bring it down, it actually allows it to go up over the margin. If you're going to use this, you might want this margin set a little bit lower. So I'm going to set it at minus 1 dB, and then I'm going to play back and let you watch how this works. Now you can see that I easily was able to peak the output by bringing that down aggressively. So really you're going to get a much more subtle effect out of that. So I'm going to put this back to minus 0.3. Now the brick wall works very similarly, it has a very similar character to it. However, the brick wall limiter will respect the margin, so you really won't get peaking over it, but it might sound pretty clippy or pretty bad if you get too aggressive with the threshold.
You said you had to break down, tell me goodbye. You didn't want to hang out, watch all the grieving. You said you had to break down to tell me.
And you can get a little overshoot with that, as you could see that it clipped the output by driving that too hard. Now, if we get into intelligent, intelligent is the algorithm. This is, I guess, the real one. This is the one that you're probably going to use for most of the mastering. Or the next one, intelligent 2. Intelligent is the version that was in Ozone 3. And it's provided here mostly for compatibility if you have projects and you wanted to use the exact same volume control. However, intelligent 2 improves on that for Ozone 4. And I would say that for most mastering, unless you're trying to emulate an older style of music production, you're probably going to want to use the intelligent 2. It gives us a great deal of clarity and transients while still allowing us to put the perceived volume level up quite a bit. So I'm going to put that on and then you'll see. Now, along with intelligent 1 and intelligent 2, we have this control here, which roughly is the speed, controls the speed of the limiting. So if you're here, the limiting happens so fast that it's clipping and you'll actually hear it sounds distorted if you push it too hard. And then you've got fast and loud. So if you want a very aggressive, really almost distorted kind of a sound, you can use these. For clear sounding music, you can start to get into smooth or transparent. And this is the range where I think this really shines. Then you've got also a very slow response as well. But transparent in this range, I think, is the area that I would almost always set this to. Prevent intersample clipping. What this does is it simulates a digital to analog converter on typical equipment. So like on a CD player when it's playing back, some of the digital to analog converters have a side effect of clipping between the peaks. And so this will simulate that and help prevent you from overloading that kind of equipment. I would always also run with this on. If you turn this off, You'll save a little bit of CPU, but then of course you run the risk of it sounding a little bit distorted on certain equipment. So this is a good option, and so is Intelligent 2. So to cut to the chase, if you're mastering with Ozone and you want to go with the most modern approach, I would use Intelligent 2, prevent intersample clipping, and then put this somewhere in the transparent range. Now, of course, you've always got to use your ears and your hearing and pay attention to the style of music you're working in when you make these kinds of generalizations. But I would say for the most part, these are a good starting point for most music. In addition to that, I'd give yourself a little bit of a headroom here by putting this at minus 0.1, 0.2, or 0.3 rather than just leaving it right at 0. So with that said, I'm going to give you an example of how I would set this up in Pro Tools using the project that we started before. And I've got my 4 songs that all have their own instance of Ozone. And in Ozone, I've made sure that all of the other modules are off. I'm using only the loudness maximizer. As I've mentioned before, I've also got all the faders set to neutral in the actual mixer for Pro Tools. I've set up memory locations in this song, and I've also positioned them into kind of the body of the song, not in the intro, but in the body of the song. And this allows me to quickly jump between and reference these songs. I've also got one set up in my reference track so I can jump quickly into my reference track if I want. I've muted it here so I don't accidentally play it because this is a well-known hit song. Now, when I play back, I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut for Pro Tools that allows me to jump to memory locations. So if I do .1 dot, I jump to location 1, .2 dot, I jump to location 2, .3 dot, like this. Now you could do this with almost any digital audio workstation, and you need to figure out how to use the memory locations in order to do that in the appropriate host. So with that said, I'm going to go to song 3 with .3 dot on the keypad, and then we'll pull back up on this. We've got to load the correct instance of Ozone, which is this one here. Also within Ozone, as I play back and compare one song to the next, I can choose which instance of Ozone, and this is the track, by this selection right here. And this is a Pro Tools specific approach. So as I switch between songs with the keyboard, I don't need to look at Pro Tools. I can just use the key command, and then I can switch to the correct song version of Ozone using this control right here. So with that said, let's go back to song 3. I'm going to do a basic level on that, and then we'll continue to check this against the other songs.
I just sat back in total amazement. Not even one tear did I cry. I thought I could easily find a replacement. Then you said this like John.
All right, now I've got a basic level set. One thing you could see is that my average RMS level was hovering right around minus 12 dB. Now, if you look at a commercially released song, it's going to be much higher than that. But for a nice sound, I think that might not be a bad starting point for this particular example. So now I'm going to go and in the next segment here, while I play back, I'm going to switch between songs, and you'll see me switch here and you'll hear the song switching.
I'm coming in the club, I'm gonna save another stranger. I need you to listen though, you and me in Mexico, riding on my rocket.
I will carry this on.
I just sat back and told all the headlights, but I'm alive. You're the one playing this deadly game. Just a few.
All right, so that gives you the basic idea of how that works. You can see that I can adjust the apparent level of all of those songs using a combination of things. One, I have these set up exactly the same between the different songs. So I've got the same, actually this is set to intelligent 1. That should be set to intelligent 2. So you're going to want to start from the same starting point, set the margin the same, and then adjust the threshold is really the only thing that you're going to want to change within the context of an album. I'm not saying you always want to use it exactly like this, but I'm saying within the context of the album, you're pretty much going to want to use volume maximizing using the same algorithms and setup. So I hope this is a good example. It should give you a fairly good idea of how you use volume maximizing. As we move on, you might want to push the volume more. Now, you've heard a lot about the volume wars in music production, and if you want to push your levels up more, Ozone is a tool that will allow you to do that. All you need to do really is choose the Intelligent 2. I would put this on. You could put this to a little bit more aggressive, fast and loud setting, and then pull this back down more. And I'm not here to judge whether you do that or not. It might make your music sound better for the appropriate intended use, or it might sound worse. But this is a good starting point, I think, for mastering and loudness maximizing. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to start talking about multiband processors. There are 3 of them: the harmonic exciter, the multiband dynamics, and the multiband stereo imaging. Now, all 3 of these share a common processing system for dividing the frequency of your song into a number of bands. You can have up to 4 bands. This example right now shows 3 bands of multiband processing. If you look at the graph, you'll see these are all organized inside of the multiband box here because they all share common controls. So the top part of the screen you'll see as I go between the different modules continues to stay the same because it shows the same mini spectrum and the breakdown of the frequencies. And I can adjust them here, like I said. You can also double click here and type in the crossover frequency. You can do that for all of these if you want to set it more accurately. You can also solo a band, so you can isolate it for listening. This B bypasses that band, bypasses the processing or all processing on that band. There's also modifiers. If I right click, it actually does this to the other bands. So by right clicking on the solo, I'm actually muting that band. And then I right click again. Another way to do that is on the Mac, option click on this, or on a PC you would alt click on this, and it actually solos the other bands, effectively muting this one. And the bypass has the same sort of thing. We can bypass the other bands, leaving the processing only on this band. So those are actually kind of helpful. I'm going to just play back a little bit and show you how the soloing works. So those are really helpful when you're trying to do comparisons to really see what you're doing as you're applying these different modules. Now, if I want to add a 4th band to this, all I need to do is go where I want to insert the band and right click, and there's an option here for insert band. So now I've added another band to processing. Likewise, I can take bands out. There's nothing saying you have to use 3 or 4 bands for multiband processing. You don't have to. You can take out additional bands and maybe just separate your high and low end. That can be very effective depending on the type of music. So I'll insert another band. Actually, I'm going to insert up to 4 bands. Now, it can get tricky to set these crossover frequencies. There's some maybe common ways that they might be set up. You can take a look at the way the presets are to get an idea of good starting points. But in the end, you actually want the crossovers to fall in areas where they're not going to be audible, because there's usually some anomaly at these crossover points. Well, Ozone 4 gives us a really excellent tool to set these frequencies, and it's the learn mode. If you right click, you'll see that there's a learn option on this menu, and all we need to do is play back our music, go into the learn mode, and Ozone will listen to the point that it can best fit those crossovers in without impacting the mix. So I'm going to demonstrate that here. I'll play back the music, go into learn mode, and you'll see how it automatically adjusts.
We are bombing the fire, the battle we are fighting, and the reason why I wanna you out of all the lies that we're running out of time.
I think that's an extremely cool functionality. It actually places those over that sample of music in the place where it has the minimal amount of frequency impact. And that gives you a good starting point. Now, you don't have to use that, but it certainly is a very nice feature and it can really speed things up. Now, that's the main functionality of this area. Now, you probably noticed that there's a white line on this screen. This white line changes functionality depending on what control within the current module has the focus. So you can see right here, this band delay on the harmonic exciter happens to have focus. So if I grab this, that will move right there. If I go to multiband dynamics and say put on the threshold for the limiter, then I can adjust that by dragging this in the different bands. This is the currently selected band. So this control changes. Now, if you don't like this, you can turn this off so you don't accidentally grab this. So some people really like this and some don't. At times I've found it's better to actually disable that. So that and the other options for this are available from the crossover options, which you can get from a right click. So I'll do that again, right click crossover options. And that's just also available from the general options button down here. If you go to the EQ Reverb crossover tab, there's a section here for the crossover options. Now you can change the number of bands here. Of course, you can do that by adding or removing bands back on the main display, but I just took a band out and then here I put that band back in. And then this is an important function here, changing the crossover type. The crossover type I've been using here is digital. This is the one from Ozone 3, and it's a very transparent type of crossover. Now, there's also the analog crossover, which would emulate more of analog mastering gear. And there's also new to, in the crossover options, new to Ozone 4 is the hybrid. And the hybrid emulates a high-end type of infinite impulse response type of filter that would typically be done with analog, and it gives you a little bit different quality. You might have to audition these. Normally, I'm setting up my whole multiband processing in the digital mode because I came from Ozone 3 and I think that has the least impact on the sound. However, I'm starting to appreciate this hybrid mode gives you a slightly warmer quality to the music. And so this is one of those things that you need to kind of go back and forth once you get things set up. But I would recommend starting with the digital type of crossover. These are the defaults here, and the buffer size gives you more and less CPU. So just like anything else with the computer, the lower the buffer, the more you can reduce the latency, but the more CPU that you'll use. So if you have the buffer up in this area, it's a good compromise. For mastering purposes where we're not trying to track against it, we can leave this buffer size fairly high. Also, there's a crossover. If you want to make the band, crossover band tighter, you can see this is a nice compromise here on the digital filter. Go back to the options here. If you move this up, then you'll see that gets tighter. So let me move it way up here. You can actually see it under here tightening up. So you get extremely, extremely steep crossover. Sometimes that can give you a little bit too much of a shelf quality, too much isolation between these bands, which is why this defaults to a much lower setting, around 5. Now, if you go to the hybrid, you can't even change that. It's just fixed. So if you're on the hybrid mode, you can't make adjustments to that. Same thing on the analog mode. But if you're on the digital mode, you can play around with this if you want to. And then this is show the mini spectrum handles. Those are these white lines that I just showed you before. If you don't want to accidentally touch those and alter any of these settings, you can turn that off. And a lot of the time I actually do turn those off because I want to make sure that I'm being very careful of adjusting these things separately. So for right now, since normally they're on, I'll turn those back on. So those are the common controls that we have on all 3 of the multiband modules. And we're going to get started with the multiband harmonic exciter in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the multiband harmonic exciter. This is the first of the multiband effects, and it's the first to take advantage of breaking the signal into up to 4 bands. In this particular example, I'm going to leave it set with 4 different bands. Now for each band, we can choose how much harmonic content we want to add to the signal, and then basically we can choose how much of that to mix in. So you could think of this as a intensity or a drive control, and then this is the mix. This does not affect our actual dry signal. This is only how much of this harmonic content we're going to add within this band. So this is set up per band. Now you can think of this by calling it harmonic content. It is really adding a distorted signal essentially to the dry signal and mixing that in parallel, which is another fairly common technique. And if we do that in a controlled way, then you can add some warmth by doing that in the mid-range, a kind of sparkle in the higher end, and on the top you can add shine, clarity, things like that can come through, and without really sacrificing headroom. That's why this type of processing was invented in the first place. And Ozone has done a pretty good job of making this current by giving you some different algorithms to use for the type of harmonic content. Retro gives you a more transistor-based, I would say more old-fashioned type of harmonic content that I don't believe sounds nearly as good as some of the other ones that are available. Tape sounds nice and smooth. Tube gives you a tube tone that's a little bit gritty, and then warm gives you a tube tone that is very smooth. And actually, it's my favorite, but when I'm auditioning and thinking about using this, I'm usually looking at tape and retro. And I'm going to mix this into the mid-band and let you hear what these different algorithms sound like, and you'll get an understanding of what I mean. Now, I'm going to really over-exaggerate this so you can really hear what this harmonic content material sounds like. When you're mixing it in for mastering, it's going to go in very, very subtly. All right, so I'm going to play back. I'm going to mix up the mid-band, solo it, and then we'll go through the different algorithms.
And the shadows of all the they will write about years to come, and it's such a shame if it's only a dream. One fool's fantasy, well, I will carry this world on. Oh, I will carry this world on.
All right, so that gives you an idea of what these different algorithms sound like. I'm going to leave it on the warm setting because I think that's a really useful setting. And one thing that we can do with this is add a little clarity. And as we said, it's called shine if you add it at the top level. And I think that's one of the most effective ways to use this type of effect. So I'm going to play back again and just add a little bit to the high end here.
Oh, what a thing to say. I would shoot.
And you can see that adds just a little bit of detail to the high end, which I think suits us fairly well in the listening environment I have right now with headphones. One thing I haven't mentioned much is that the listening environment is very important when you're adding these subtle details. So you want to make sure that you have some sound treatment in your room and that you have decent monitor speakers, or none of this is going to really work very well for you. Now, the lower part of this allows us to delay the individual bands by a few milliseconds. This kind of phase delay introduces the psychoacoustic effect that whatever you hear earlier tends to sound louder. So if you delay a band, it can set it back in the mix a little bit. And that is useful mostly on the low end in my experience. I've tried using this in the mid-range, and I really don't trust that I'm not upsetting the phase coherence of my song. But on the low end and below the low end, it actually does help tighten up the bass. So I'm going to play back and do this. I'm not clear if you'll be able to hear this, and it's going to depend on how you listen to this. But if you have a good listening environment, the effect is noticeable when you add a little bit of delay to the low end. Now I'm talking about 1, 2, or 3 milliseconds of delay.
The moon. Oh, I would shoot the moon. Oh, what a thing to say. I would shoot the moon. But my gambles never pay. They were right about.
Now you can correspondingly, when you do this, it tightens it up. It might lower the effect of it, the sound of it. You might need to bring it up or compress it slightly more on the low end, which you can later do with the multiband dynamics. And Ozone actually in the manual covers this concept, and particularly the mastering guide, which is an excellent resource as you're working on mastering. Now, taking these two concepts a bit further, we can separate the channels, mid-channel and the side channel, using the new mid-side processing. So if I go ahead and do that, I'm going to activate mid-side processing. Now in the mid, I can control it separately. So in the mid, I've applied my bass delay on this band, and then on the side, I've applied the high-end sparkle. And so now I'm not going to be affecting the side channels with this delay, and I'm not going to be affecting the mid channel with the sparkle, only to the sides where it's really going to give me a little bit better imaging. And so I'm going to play this back with it set up this way.
Years to come, and it's such a shame if it's only a dream. One fool's fantasy, one fool's fantasy, one fool's fantasy, one fool's.
And like a lot of things in mastering, as you get closer and closer to the right settings, it becomes more and more difficult to actually hear the effect as you bypass it, because this is more subtle because I've tailored the bass only where the bass lives and the side channel just to add a little bit of sparkle. These are the kinds of details when you really get into professional mastering that you want to pay attention to. Anyway, the multiband harmonic exciter is good for these tools. I think it's best used very sparingly. It's a spice to add a little bit of seasoning to the mix, but it's not a tool that I would use very heavy-handedly. Well, thanks for watching this. I think you'll have a much better understanding of the multiband harmonic exciter, and I'll see you again in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the multiband dynamics. Now this is a multiband compressor, not just a compressor, but also a limiter and expander that breaks your signal into 4 bands based on the multiband processing. And then we can apply a very sophisticated multiband compressor setup to each band independently. Now this gives us a lot of advantages in tailoring the sound because we can do a lot more with compression with multiband without affecting the other bands. So say we're going to do something on the bass end with the compressor, it's not going to start to duck the highs because we've separated the bands. One of the really nice things about using multiband compression. The downside of multiband compression is there's a lot of controls on the screen. The best way to really go over this is to just go over how the controls work for a single band, and then you can apply those to all the different bands. So we're going to start here looking on the screen and just go through all of these different controls. Now, this is the mix level. Normally, we're going to start with this all the way up. This is useful for a specific type of an effect called parallel compression, sometimes called New York compression, where you apply a high level of compression, but you mix it in under your dry signal. And so Ozone now supports parallel compression using the band mix slider. And then moving on to the band gain, each individual band has a gain. So if I go to the band gain and move this here, I can essentially do something that would be like a multiband equalizer. So I can use the multiband compressor like an equalizer by doing a boost or cut in any of these bands. And it is one of the simplest ways to get into using the multiband dynamics is you can load a preset, set up your crossovers, and then you can tailor your sound by grabbing and basically changing the band gain. We're also going to use the band gain as a makeup gain as we set up the compressor, the limiter. As we start to take gain out, we'll need to put it back in here. Now there is automatic gain compensation. This uses an AGC circuit, an automatic gain control circuit, that goes through the entire Ozone plugin to balance the RMS level between the input and the output. It doesn't automatically set any of these controls. I think that this AGC is useful if you're comparing one setting to another, one preset to another. It can help take out gain boosts. Anytime you get a gain boost, you tend to think something sounds better than something that's a little bit lower. So this is the threshold for the limiter. And as we look, this is the curve here for basically all of the different processors we've got going on any one band. And I'm going to get playback going here and then mute the volume.
I'll show you the stars.
And you can see here that as I manipulate this, it also adjusts the gain in the histogram view right here. So I can very easily set this threshold to the top of the histogram, and that kind of gives me a starting point for that gain for the threshold limit. Now, the threshold ratio is typically set pretty high, where a normal compression ratio for compression might be 2:1 or 4:1. The compression ratio for a limiter is much higher, like 11:1, and this one will go all the way up to 30:1, which gives you almost brick wall type flatline compression. I don't typically like to set it quite that high, but if you put it at 11 or 12, you'll get pretty typical type of limiting effect, as you'll see over here. And we can also see the level of gain reduction that we're getting here as somewhere around 8 dB, which is pretty significant. I can move this back here and I'll get a little bit more. I could compensate over here by adding a little gain back in to keep my output pretty consistent. Now, moving along to the compressor threshold, the compressor threshold works the same way. It's just that this on the graph view here is the limiter threshold, and this is the compressor threshold. And so typically, you're going to want to set that lower, and then as your signal operates in its normal range, you're going to be doing basic program compression in this range. And so I would say that on a typical setup, that isn't going to be set to be that hard of a curve. So I've got it set here 2:1, and you could go even lower, like 1.5:1 or something like that, to get very gentle compression, just a little bit more control. One of the things that's useful to do with the multiband dynamics is to give yourself a little bit of gain control before you go into the loudness maximizer, so that the loudness maximizer doesn't do all the work of increasing your output level. And so we can do that in stages by starting to control it here on the compressor, and then going up and controlling a little bit more at the limiter, and then kicking the loudness maximizer in as yet another stage. And that's really the way that you build the loudness profile of your song. Now let's just take a look at the rest of the curve. Down below this area, we've got the expander. Now the expander's threshold, we can bring it in if we want to use it. And as you move it forward like this, you'll see that the curve in high numbers like this will drop off dramatically after this point. Now typically you would set this as, if you want to use it as a noise gate, particularly to remove hiss or something on the high end of your material, you can set this like this, give it a fairly steep curve, and then set your noise threshold right here. I would typically do that on the higher bands because you don't often have audible hiss in the lower bands. And then you can basically gate these off, and you also need to control the release time and the attack time on that so you don't get some pumping kinds of effects from that. So this basically outlines that. You could also use an upward expansion by bringing up the low-level signals by flipping this backwards. So if we go into the negative, you'll see if we go below that threshold, we could also bring up low-level signals. So if there is something buried in the band, in the mix that's at a low level, you could bring it up by bringing this kind of upward expansion below that area. Now, typically, if you're not going to use noise gating or that upward expansion, you can take this threshold and just move it like this and get it out of the way. And then now we've got a two-part compression to look at. Also, anything else you want to take out of the way, if you want to do only limiting on the bands, like say you don't want to really use this ratio here, you can either set this ratio to 1, which means it does nothing, or you can take this threshold all the way off, and now we've got a simple limiter, and we can adjust the limiting right here. Very, very flexible, and the great thing about it is that we've got it set up like this across all of these different bands. And we can really mess up our sound just as well as we can improve the sound using these tools. One thing I wanted to point out is there's an additional button here for RMS detection. This actually changes quite a lot the characteristics of how this whole thing works, because now we're doing an averaging type of a compressor as opposed to a peak compressor. So a peak compressor is probably going to have a little bit more impact on the nature of the way it sounds as it manipulates the peaks. And RMS detection is going to use average volume level or perceived volume. For mastering purposes, if you're using this as a preprocessor for loudness maximizer, you might want to consider using the RMS detection. I believe you get more transparent compression using this feature. Now, as we move along and take a look at what's underneath here, there's additional settings that you're probably wondering where they are. If you click this button here, you'll see here is for the limiter, this is the attack time and the release time. For the compressor, the attack time, the release time, and then for the expander, the attack and release times. And you see that they're set to fairly reasonable values here. The limiter is set to 5 millisecond attack, and the release is set to 100. The typical kind of guideline is you're going to want to set this to 5 milliseconds for an attack, or maybe 10 milliseconds for an attack to get started. If you set the attack too aggressively, too quickly, then you kill your transients. The other thing is if you set the attack too fast on low-end material, because the waveform is quite long, has quite a long period, you can get a kind of distortion by having an attack time that gives you kind of a false triggering effect. So normally you'd set the attack time a little bit higher in the 5 to 10 millisecond range and then adjust it from there. And as you adjust it, you can hear the effect on the transients of different kinds of material. And then the release time of 100 is also a fairly good starting point for working with compressors. And of course you can adjust that too, as you start to work with this and to, listen to the effect that that has on your sound. Now these settings here are under attack release settings. You can hide and show them. And there's an additional checkoff here for auto smoothing. Auto smoothing gives Ozone the option of slightly changing these values to give less distortion or to get a more smooth sound. And I think it's a great feature, and I would certainly leave that on. Now, one more control here is this one that says global and band. For these two controls, we can operate them across all the bands at once, increasing the gain of the whole thing, or also for the parallel compression, we can control that here across all the bands together if that's set up that way. Normally, I don't run it that way, but that's an option if you'd like to use it. And so those are all the settings that we have for the basic part of the compressor. Now, we also do have the stereo mono or the mid-side processing, which means all of these things that we've just covered are multiplied by 2. We can do the compression in the mid band or on the side band for our song. And the reason you might want to do that is because you can do stuff to affect, say, the lead vocal or particularly the bass by working on the mid separately from the side. So you can leave the side band more open and maybe a little less compressed while you're working on things to bring the vocal up or bring the vocal down. Now, how do you actually use this is the subject of what I guess you study if you're really looking into the details of mastering. Well, one thing you can do is use it as an EQ by just manipulating this band. The other thing, as I said before, you can use multi-band compression in order to pre-compress before you hit your loudness maximizer to help bring up the overall volume or the perceived volume of the mix. And then the other thing you can do is you can tighten up things that just aren't under control. So you can zoom in on maybe a bass frequency and tighten those things up a little bit if there's a problem with the mix. So with that, we've covered all the various controls related to the multi-band dynamics. Now, while it's a fairly complex module, the controls are laid out and organized in a very nice way, and we've also got great metering to go along with it. In addition, we've got some powerful mid-side functionality. Now, we don't have time to go over every application because this can be used many different ways. But as multiband compressors go and multiband dynamics go, this is a great tool for your mastering. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the multiband stereo imaging. And like all the other multiband effects, it uses the setup that they share with the multiband crossover at the top of the screen. So we can control the wideness or the stereo image for each band. Now, in general, this one slider is all you really need to get that done. As you increase the slider, it uses an effect, which I believe is based on a mid-side processing, to increase the apparent width of each of these individual bands. Now, ordinarily, if you wanted to create the illusion of a widening, you're going to want to do those processes on the higher end material because you can't discern low-end stereo width very well, and as a matter of fact, there's some benefit to maybe even going more to the mono side. So neutral means that we're not making any change where it's at 0. But if we push it up like this means we're widening the stereo image in that band. If we pull it down like this, we're going more towards mono. So how would you actually use this in a song? Well, you might use it to actually create more stereo width, as I said. So I'll play back part of one of Johnny Gibbs' songs, and I'll manipulate these controls so you can listen to what it does to the mix.
All the headlights, but I'm alive. You're the one playing this deadly game. Just a few bumps, but he's still the same.
Now I want to point out that you could hear the widening by moving the higher bands up. I also tried lowering the width of the low end. This is a technique that's sometimes used to tighten up the bass, to actually fold it back into mono. So sometimes I would do that if, particularly on a bass heavy song, you can get some advantages on playback from doing that. I'm certainly not saying that that would be standard procedure. You do that all the time. It's a technique that you can play with, especially if you lower this crossover frequency down a little bit more. Now, these meters we're covering in a separate video on meters, but the correlation meter, essentially, the more it's toward plus, the more our material is mono, and the more that it's towards -1, the more the left and the right side are completely different. And you saw that even without the changes that I made here, this particular mix has quite a great deal of variation in this area. So there is a fairly broad stereo spectrum to start with, but as you push this up, you'll see that that will increase on this metering. Now, that basically covers these controls. You can play around with these. I find that it sounds a bit unnatural as you go to the extremes. And I also use this effect more when I feel like there's a narrowness or something lacking in the mix. If I've got a nice broad mix, I wouldn't necessarily just always throw these things in. Like the other effects, particularly like the harmonic exciter, it's really more of a spice, something that you can add. I'm almost more likely to make the low band mono than I am to do a lot of work in these widening areas. You might be better to return to the mix if you lack width. However, these tools are here if you want to use them. Now, this area here is the ability to delay left from right in these different bands. There's also the option of grouping all the delay bands together. But in general, if you have something that's wrong with the recording, where say you had a stereo mic on an acoustic guitar and one side's coming through louder than the other, you can adjust the bands to focus in on that instrument, and then on the loud side push a delay to the side that's louder to delay that a little bit, and then it will help balance it out in the mix. It's a way to do it without using tone controls, and I would say that these delay adjustments are definitely for corrective actions, not really for a delay effect. But I'm going to group them and move them back and forth with the mix playing. There's nothing wrong with this mix where I need them, but just so you get the idea of, as I push it to the right, it will actually shift the kind of the apparent volume more to the left because I've induced a delay to the right side. So I'll manipulate these controls so you can hear how this sounds.
A cinema
I'm using a keyboard shortcut to zero these controls out. Holding down the Option key and clicking will send it back to the neutral position, or holding down the Alt key and clicking on a PC will send it back to the middle position. And so that's a trick that I've been using throughout the videos, but I thought it's worth mentioning that again. So this is a fairly simple module. It's multi-band, but the bands are all shown right on the screen, so nothing really changes as you click on these different bands here. And we actually have two different kinds of effects. We've got the widening effect with the simple back and forth fader. We've got the delays along the bottom that can be grouped if you've got something out of balance. So with that, I've covered the multiband stereo imaging. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the input-output meters. Now, we talked about the basic functionality of these meters earlier on, but now we're going to go into some more detail on these meters and some options you have when looking at the input-output metering. Now, first of all, when we play back, we get this bar graph, which shows the RMS value plus an additional metering that goes above and also holding onto the peaks. Now, let me just play a bit of music back. Now, if we actually exceed 0 and we actually overrun the peak, then there's some additional things that happen. So I'm going to push the output volume up until we hit an overrun and then stop and explain what I mean. All right, so now I hit an overrun, and you'll see right here, these LED segments come up, and embedded in those segments, the small numbers tell you how many samples you overran the peak. Now, if you actually overrun it by more than 99, it will show an ellipsis or 3 periods in that area. And then to clear this, you just click right there, and that'll clear it. This is also the value of the peaking, so if I click that, that will also clear that. I used the output fader to actually add gain to overload it. So I'm going to reset this using Option click, which will put it back to its original position of 0 dB. That would be Alt click on a PC. Now, sometimes it's useful to zoom in on the area that you're working on the top end of the scale, and you can do that using the plus button here or zoom out with the minus button here. Also, if we right click here and go to I/O options, it pulls up options, which would be the same as clicking options here and going to the I/O tab, and now we've got more options for metering. One is we can disable the meter altogether. I'm not sure why you would do that, but if you do, it will take the metering off. Also, we can take the peak hold off, and that's the bar that holds on to the peak. And also we have the option to do detect intersample peaks. We had a similar option earlier in the loudness maximizer. I always run with this on. You can conserve a little bit of CPU if you turn this off. What this does is it simulates the digital to analog converter on consumer grade equipment to help you pick up peaks that would happen kind of as an anomaly with that kind of converter design. So it's better off to run with that on and be safer about it. So I'm going to turn these two on and off while I play back just so you can see the effect it has on the metering.
We'll reap the better of my price. Oh, I could still be free, yeah.
Sometimes it's actually nice to work with the peak hold turned off. I think the peak hold is a great feature and we've all become accustomed to seeing that. However, it puts a little bit more emphasis on that peak than maybe is necessary when you're actually looking at this. The average level might be more important for your work. Now, the type option allows us to choose between an RMS plus peak meter, which is the main way that we've been using this system throughout, but you can also choose an RMS only or a peak only meter. And there are some advantages to looking at an RMS meter. If you want to simplify your view and get back to something that's more like a VU meter, you can turn off peak hold, run with RMS, and then it would look like this.
It's the perfect day, perfect day, perfect day for me, and the shadows are all.
So if you came from analog background and you want something more familiar that works a lot more like a regular old mechanical VU meter, then that would be a setup that you could use. It also takes some of the clutter off the screen and helps you focus a little bit better. I like the RMS plus peak for typical work, and then also there's the K system option. We're going to do a separate video on the K system, but just in general, the K system moves the 0 dB line down, giving you a reference for your average volumes rather than just always trying to mix to the full scale. So let's not talk about that now. We'll cover that in a separate video. Now the next option is the type of scale dB nonlinear. Because hearing and a dB scale inherently is not linear, you can see that it compresses the scale as you move down here. And if you wanted to look at every dB unit being equal, like up here you can see that from 0 to 12 is the same as from 12 to 20 and then 20 to 30. It's not actually set up linear. It's set up in a useful way. But if you want that to look linear, then you can also go to linear, because some equipment you might be familiar with is laid out this way. I would run nonlinear pretty much 100% of the time for the work that I'm doing. Now you can set the source to stereo or mid-side. We showed this before, that the mid-band, it shows up as orange and the sideband shows up as blue. You can choose whether that's set up here or here. However, you can always change it back and forth with this button right here on the metering. All right, so the peak hold time is the amount of time that the peak holds on the screen before it goes out. So I'll show you an example of that by playing back and setting this to different values.
And it's such a shame if it's only a dream. One false fantasy. Well, I will carry this one.
Now I think 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second, is a pretty good value for the peak hold time. Sometimes you might want to set it to infinite and it will just hold the highest peak throughout the entire song. That can be useful too. However, if you do that, it will stay there forever until you clear it. And you clear it by clicking in the max peak readout area up here. So let me just play back and show you that. So that's how you clear that. I normally leave this set to 1,000. Now the integration time is the amount of time on the VU meter that it actually takes for calculating the RMS, or the apparent volume. And 300 milliseconds would be typical for a VU meter, and I always leave this set here. However, if you wanted to, you can increase this time and then you get a longer average time. You can also decrease it going down to 10. But I think 300 is a great and useful value for that. Also, there's the max peak readout, or the current peak readout. Up here, it tells you the maximum peak achieved. And you can either set it to current or peak. So if we set it to peak, this is the normal mode of operation. This peak will stay here until you clear it by clicking. Or you can set it to the current, and then you can, in real time, watch your peak values. So we'll set this back to max peak. So that is all of the options related to the input-output meters. Now there's one other thing, is we have input-output gain. We can set a gain level when bypassed. As we do more things with loudness maximizing, you get a apparent volume boost. So sometimes it's useful when you bypass the effect if you can have a little bit of gain added. So I'm going to show you how this works. Now, of course, we're also overloading the signal by doing that. But basically, the idea here is that anything that's louder tends to sound better. So if you want to do an A/B comparison of taking your effect in and out, then this is one way that you can use to add some gain back in to your unprocessed signal to get a better comparison. So let me clear this with an option click. That would be alt click on a PC. Another way to do this is to use this, and this will automatically match the gain as you're in bypass mode. So I'm going to leave that on and play back a little bit and show you how that sounds.
I would shoot the moon. Oh, I would
And even though we're overloading, it is a very effective way of matching the volume of what we're doing with ozone with the bypass signal. So I wouldn't run that all the time, but if you're doing A/B comparisons, this is a great thing to use. Now, another thing to point out with this is that depending on the host environment, this feature may or may not work if you use the host bypass. It depends on how those two parts communicate with each other. Let me show you what I mean. It does work correctly in Pro Tools with my experiments. I'm just going to actually turn this down so we get a really dramatic effect when we're bypassing. All right, so you can hear what it sounds when it's bypassed. Now I'm going to use the Pro Tools bypass feature here and see if we get the same effect. So with Pro Tools, it works correctly in that these two components, Ozone and Pro Tools, communicate enough that the bypass does keep this in. You have to understand that if you're using this feature, if you add gain here or this button here, then when Ozone is bypassed, it's not fully bypassed because it's actually adding a gain stage in if you move this off of 0. So with that, we've covered everything to do with the metering in Ozone, and you should have a very good understanding now how to tweak these meters. And we also want to cover the K system, and we'll do that in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the K system options for the Ozone metering. Now, if we want to try the K system, we need to look at the I/O options, and you set up the K system by changing this value, the type, to the K system. And you'll see that by comparison to, if we look at a peak RMS, 0 dB rides right at the top, which is full scale. So you can't overload that at all. So if you're trying to mix or master to full scale, you tend to wind up trying to get as close as you can to 0 without going over. One of the downsides of this approach is that you tend to have a very, very compressed output. One of the things that Bobcats has introduced is using a K system where we actually try to mix to 0 dB at a lower level so that there's still headroom for peaks to preserve the dynamics of the material. And along with this system is calibrating your monitors to a constant or a fixed volume at 0 dB. Now the way you do this is to use a pink noise sample, play back the pink noise with one monitor turned off. In the listening position, you want to get 83 dB of signal or of noise in the mix position through one monitor. That's how you calibrate the system. And then it's actually quite loud if you actually set this up, which I've done here. And it helps keep you from mixing too loud. So if you actually lower the monitor volume, you might tend to try to push it up to get it to where it sounds loud enough. Anyway, this is translatable from one system and one room to the next if it's calibrated this way. There's 3 different scales that are used for 3 different intentions, where K20 would be used for high dynamic range, like orchestral music or for film music. And then K14 would be used for the vast majority of music production, where K12 is reserved for lower bandwidth broadcast production. So you can do yourself a big favor by mixing using K14. You can also retain a K14 metering system while you're mastering, and then you would do a lot less loudness maximizing to really squash your signal by using it this way. So regardless of whether you want to use it or not, I think mixing to K14 is really helpful, and you can use the metering in Ozone to do that if you put Ozone in your master fader as the very last module. Now you can't use this metering if you've got any other gain stages that follow Ozone. So if you're turning something down after Ozone, then this isn't going to work for you. That's why I've stressed throughout this series that you need to leave the faders at 0 dB for this to actually work correctly. So let's just take a look at how to interpret the K-system meter. Very much like the other meter, it's just that 0 dB is moved lower, and then we've got the peaking here. Now when you mix, you can actually allow some peaking. So if I play back,
They will write about years to come, and it's such a shame if it's only a dream. One full
so if you play back in K14, you'd be targeting your RMS level for the body of your song, the loud parts of your song, somewhere around 0 dB, and allow peaks in the range of 6 dB for the actual peak, extreme volume or special effects hits or things like that. Now, this is not supposed to be a overall masterclass on the K system. There's a lot more to it than that, and you will do yourself a favor to get the second edition of the book, Mastering Audio, The Art and Science by Bob Katz, and it's fully described in there. There are many resources online that also describe it. I do want to point out that it's not that difficult, and I think you can even gain some benefit from practicing mixing with K14, even if you haven't calibrated your monitors. Just set it to a loud level at 0 dB and try mixing with the K system and see what you think. Though you can pretty easily configure K system monitoring with a simple SPL meter, and you probably should have one of those in your toolkit anyway. So that's the K system support for the metering in Ozone 4. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about two more kinds of meters we have that are very important mastering tools for looking at the stereo image. Now, we've seen these before because they appear in the mastering reverb and the multiband stereo imaging modules. Both have access to these meters. Also, if we look at the graph, we'll see these are the very last things typically in the signal chain. Now, the correlation meter is probably a little bit easier to understand. Basically, when the meter is going to the +1 side, it's more mono. So the more that the left and the right channels are the same, the more it's going to tend here. It has a history, so as things are plotted on here, they will fade out over time. The current signal is bright, and then it fades out over the time. So as you watch, you'll see in something with a good stereo spread that there'll be some light color will start to develop a history in here. So I'm going to play back a little bit of Martha Berner's Fool's Fantasy again, and I'll let you watch what happens with the correlation meter here. So you can see how that draws in and then it fades out. And this isn't that unusual. It does show that there's a little room for opportunity maybe to increase the stereo spread. And we already showed you the widening tools here that we have available. So I'm going to demonstrate just pushing up the stereo width by forcing these bands to widen out, and you'll see the effect on the correlation meter.
I will carry this one. Fortune tellers lies.
So this would represent an overall wider stereo image, or more difference between the two different channels. So it's a very helpful tool to take a look at. Also, it's a nice tool to use when comparing to your reference mixes. You can take a look at how they're behaving in this respect. Now, before you do a lot of effects using band widening, you could also consider going back to the actual mix if you didn't feel like you're getting enough width in the stereo spectrum. Now, the vector scope is a little bit more comprehensive or scientific view of the same kind of information. One thing confusing about vector scopes is usually they're tilted by 90 degrees. So what we're doing is plotting a point at any point in time where we're superimposing the left and the right channel onto a graph. So if the left channel's at a certain level, say we go up this way, and if the right channel is exactly the same, we go up this way and we plot a point right here. The effect of that is that anything that's mono or common between the two channels will wind up in a line or a tendency of a line in this axis. Now, if you did this with a normal oscilloscope, this would not be tilted like this, so you'd expect the thing to be at an angle. But in reality, vector scopes are typically oriented 90 degrees off so that you can see a vertical line for correct mono information. So let me just demonstrate that.
We'll reap the better.
So a correct stereo signal is usually going to have a lot of information in the vertical plane. You can also see that those things are plotted out over time and then they fade out much the way the correlation meter does. So that was a correct signal. Now you're going to get things more off into the difference area as you have a wider stereo signal. So I'll demonstrate that as well by increasing the band here.
Of my price, oh, I could still be free, yeah. It's the perfect J, perfect J.
So a wider stereo spectrum, where it's more different between the left and the right channels, will give you a fatter looking line here between them. Now, along with this, we have the channel ops, which allows us to actually move it to mono. So I'm going to do that while playing back, and you'll see that that becomes a perfectly straight line, and the correlation meter will go to 1.
Perfect J for me, and the shadows of all of our
Now, one of the reasons that vector scopes are commonly used, or a phase correlation meter like this, is to pick up problems. So if you have something that's actually out of phase, like the left channel or the right channel is inverted, which could happen depending on how things are mic'd. So if you're doing mastering on something that was, say, a acoustic guitar, for instance, and the signal's coming through the vector scope, you might see that it's tilted or actually going the wrong way on here, which could indicate that the way it was mic'd, you've got one mic out of phase with the other. You could easily visually pick that up on here, and I'll demonstrate that by just playing back this material and inverting the left and then the right channels. You can see how it looks very different on the screen.
and it's such a shame.
Now we could also switch the left and right channels. Sometimes switching the left and the right channels can switch the perspective of the recording and actually can make a little bit of a difference in the sound. It can also help you feel if there's a phase problem.
If it's only a dream.
Nonetheless, it's a tool that you can use when you're listening to your mastering project or your mixing project. Now, rotating the phase 90 degrees is a very certain case, used usually for voiceover work, because once in a while when you record something, it actually winds up being slightly biased so that it's going more positive than negative. If you rotate the phase by 90 degrees, then you basically offset that type of asymmetry in the waveform, and you're not going to hear much of an effect if I do that, at least I don't think, but I will play this back and click that.
False fantasy. Well, I will carry this.
So that is a summary of how these two meters work, and their application is very useful for troubleshooting and also to give you a reference point for how wide your mix is compared to your reference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to cover the topic of dithering in a little bit more detail. Now, dithering is the step where we add a little bit of noise as we reduce the bit depth from 24 bits to 16 bits. That is the most common application of this, though it could be used for other bit depth changes, like if you're going to 8-bit for a video game of some sort. You could also use dithering for that as well. But fundamentally, dithering is to make CDs sound better, which is a 16-bit medium. In the way we've got our project set up, each song has its own instance of Ozone, and we're also going through the same output and the same master fader. Like I've said, I've got all the master faders set to 0, so we have no gain stages. That way, the metering in Ozone is working correctly, and the dithering will work correctly. Now, we could go into each instance of Ozone and set up the dithering in each instance. However, when we do the final export or the mix, so if I do bounce to disk, I get this dialog in Pro Tools that shows that the control room is the final source of our mix, and it will actually mix down through there for our final output. So ideally, and even according to the guidelines for Pro Tools, we really want our dithering plugin the very last thing before the master fader. So in a correctly configured mastering project, we're going to need to put a dithering plugin here. Now, DigiDesign has their own that we could use, But one of the advantages of Ozone is it's got great dithering technology. So I'm going to insert another Ozone instance on the master fader. And on this instance of Ozone, I'm going to turn off all of the processing for the modules because we're going to use only dithering. Even the loudness maximizer can be bypassed because you can see that that's separate from the dithering section. I also want to make sure on all of the other channels that the dithering is not enabled. So I will check that dithering is not enabled on all of the other instances. So on the master fader version of Ozone, we're going to actually turn on the dithering, and we're going to go through the dithering options now. One of the things I want to do is to try to simplify the dithering options. There are many options here that you can choose from. So I'll go over what these are, but I'm going to highlight the ones that you probably want to use when setting up dithering for your project. So first of all, the DC filter offset, which would take bias one way or the other of your signal, you definitely want this on before you dither. As you're dithering, you're going to add a little bit of noise, which could overload your signal. If you have even the slightest DC offset, it could cause clipping in one direction or the other. So to turn dithering on, we'll turn it on here. We're going to choose 16 bits, even though 8, 20, and other options are available. You can see 8 bits there. We'll put it on 16 bits. Now the dithering options include type 1, which is probably an older type of dithering. The simplest type, using a rectangular distribution function, I would not use this. Type 2 is a nice sounding dithering that has different options for noise shaping. Noise shaping takes the dithering signal. Basically, we're taking like a little bit of almost like white noise and adding it to the signal. And without explaining exactly why, it has the effect of taking away some of the distortion we get when we remove the lower bits from our signal. In a way, it's like aliasing or anti-aliasing. If you have a digital picture, you add a little noise around the edge so that it doesn't look jagged against a solid background. Now, noise shaping, we have simple clear, which is a good setting, or Psych 5 and Psych 9, which are also good settings, but they work only for conversions using 44.1 sampling rates. So if you're going to use type 2, then set this to clear, 16 bits, and then the number of bits here set to 1, I think is probably fine as well. Now, as we look through these options, we also have auto blanking, which will turn off the dithering noise in the event that you don't have any input signal for about a second or 0.7 seconds. One of the things to really cut to the chase is that iZotope has worked very hard to create a very transparent and natural sounding dithering algorithm, and that's their Mbit Plus. So if you're using Ozone, even though this requires a little more processing, unless there's some reason to prevent you from using Mbit Plus, just put it on Mbit Plus and then set the noise shaping to possibly to high, the bit depth to 16, and the dither amount to normal, and you'll actually be in very good shape. Now, the thing that might be a problem with this is that the more noise that you add to the signal, the more likely that you might peak or overload the signal, because you can see the noise right here. And so, therefore, you might want to experiment while playing back these different settings to see how much noise shaping you can get away with. I'm going to play back a little bit of this song and try to give you an example of that.
So I could easily find a replacement. And you sat there slack jawed and eyes open wide. You asked
In this example, I can go with ultra noise shaping and high dither, and I had no problem with overloading the signal. So this would be an excellent setup. Now, one of the things is you can also listen to get an idea of what this dither noise sounds like. The best way to do that is to flip this into the 8-bit mode. Now you can actually hear the dither. I'm going to turn this up a little bit. That's the dither noise that's being added. And if we adjust these signals here, then you can hear the differences. And this is the effect of the noise shaping. No noise shaping, light, medium, or high. Now, In reality, this noise is going to be completely imperceptible to you, so you really need to just choose good standard settings and then make sure that you use it consistently throughout your project. So let's just cut to the chase. With dithering, you want to make sure it's on your master fader as the very last plugin. Choose the Mbit Plus or alternatively the Type 2 and Clear for the setting, but I'm going to use the Mbit Plus. The noise shaping, I would choose High or Ultra. If you see that you're getting peaks as you add this, then back off on this setting here. Bit depth, clearly, that's going to be 16 and normal for this setting right here. Auto blanking is a matter of preference. If you don't want to hear this dither noise in the background, then this will mute it while you're not playing back. Not a bad setting. Now, as you add aggressive noise shaping to your signal, you could also cause peaks, as I was explaining before. So limiting the peaks adds a little bit of additional processing to pull the peaks back caused by too much noise being added to the signal. Another thing is harmonic suppression. In the event that for some reason you don't want to do any complete dithering, so you turn the amount of dither to none, then we're doing a truncation. You can still give Ozone the option to do a little bit of analysis to do the truncation in a way that doesn't cause harmonic artifacts. Again, this is an option I would rarely ever use because I'm always going to put this to normal. So with that, I hope you have a better understanding of the dithering options. At the end of this process, you'll still have a 24-bit bit depth. However, the lowest 8 bits will all be set to 0. When we do the final bounce to disk, and this is with Pro Tools, this setting right here on the bounce is the thing that actually converts it to 16 bits. So with that, I hope you have a better understanding of how to apply dithering to your music. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about CPU optimization when using Ozone. Now, Ozone is a single plugin, but when you install it, it's almost like installing 7, 8, or 9 plugins at one time. And there's a few simple things you can do if you're having a hard time running Ozone with your project. So we're going to go through the simplest one first, and that is just bypass the unused effects. Like the paragraphic equalizer, if you've got it in a flatline mode, it's doing nothing in your project, then just deactivate that. Another thing is, in your host program, increase the buffer size. When you're mastering, you don't need low latency monitoring or anything like that. There's no reason you can't increase the buffer size. This gives your computer more time to process before playing back, and that will give Ozone some breathing room. Another one is the mastering reverb. As we mentioned before, the room reverb algorithm uses quite a bit of computing power. You have the option to switch to the plate, or don't use the mastering reverb if it's not essential on your project. Now, you could disable the meters, and that'll help a little bit. I think there's other things that you could do that are probably more useful than that because you really need the meters when you're using Ozone. I guess in the final rendering, maybe you could turn them off. Another good thing that you can do is in the multi-band modules, you can use less bands. So there's nothing to say you need to use all 4 bands in the multi-band modules. You can do effective mastering with 3 bands or even 2 bands. So if you're having a hard time keeping Ozone running effectively, then try running with less bands. Now, if your album was recorded in a similar way and has similar tonal qualities and the mastering can be applied the same or very similar to each song, then you don't need to have a separate track and a separate instance of Ozone for every song. I've changed the project a little bit to show you what I mean. It is possible to create one track and put all your songs on one track and then use Ozone on the master fader. This instance of Ozone is bypassed here. So this is the only active instance of Ozone, and I have all of my plugins now running through there. In order for this to work, your songs need to be very similar. You could do a little bit of editing in Pro Tools to balance the volumes, and the other thing you could do is you could do automation to bring in or out different modules at different times to add a little bit of something different to each song. So that's another option you have. Now, if you want to get into a little bit more detail about CPU optimization, there's a few other things you could try. In the options, in the EQ Reverb Crossover tab, there's a couple of buffer size settings. In the equalizer, you have a buffer size setting here, and if you put it on the digital version of the equalizer, you can then run the CPU meter. On the Mac, it's the activity monitor, and change this setting and see what setting uses the least CPU. So that's kind of a exercise you can do if you're really concerned about optimizing it. Same thing with the crossover is once you've got this set, you can also on the crossover put the crossover to the digital mode and then try different buffer sizes here. There are no rules really about how to set these buffer sizes. You can start with the defaults and then watch the CPU meter either in your host software or in your operating system and see what impact it has. Now these tips should be helpful. However, most modern computers are capable of running many instances of Ozone without a lot of trouble. But if you do have issues with this, then these tips should be helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to create two presets to use as a basis or a starting point for mastering. I'm going to use some of my favorite settings as I go through to build the preset, so it'll speed up the work when I'm going into a mastering project. Now I'm going to click presets here to save the preset, and I've already created a folder called My Presets. To create a folder, you just click in this area and then hit New Folder and type in the folder name. Now I'm going to use My Presets and I put an exclamation point before the name to get it at the top of the list when sorted in name order. I've named this preset Groove 3 Mastering, and I already have it saved, but I can update it at any point by just clicking Update here, and that adds my new changes to this preset. So moving along, we're going to look at the modules. I'm going to go over the decisions I made when creating my preset. First of all, the parametric equalizer, I like to leave it flat, but I also like the option to create a high-pass filter in the very first frequency band. So here I'm going to select high pass, and I'm going to adjust this to 20 Hertz, and I'll just bring this in a little bit. Sometimes this can help save energy on playback that you really can't hear the difference, and sometimes it'll also tighten up the track a little bit. I don't always want to do that, so I'm going to set it up, but then turn it off. I'm also leaving this set to analog because I like the way the roll-off works better with the analog filter. In practice, if I'm going to do a lot of manipulations with the paragraphic equalizer, I might switch this to digital or the matching mode if I'm deciding to match the EQ, but I'm going to use this as my starting point. Moving on to the mastering reverb, I start with 100% dry signal. I've selected the room algorithm, and for the wet signal, I'm going to put this on 5. Because when I use a mastering reverb, I usually don't put that much in. I'm going to reduce the room size just a little bit here. I think the damping factor also, I'll bring that back a little bit. Pre-delay, I'll make that 5 milliseconds, and I'll take the width out a little bit. These are just settings that I'm kind of familiar with and I think will work as a good starting point. In reality, I'll leave the mastering reverb deactivated unless I feel like I need it on the track. Moving on to the loudness maximizer, I'm going to start with the threshold all the way up on the loudness maximizer. I'm going to set the margin at minus 0.3 dB. Also, I'm going to move this out to the transparent range that I like to work in. Turn on the intersample clipping and change the mode to Intelligent 2. This is my standard setup. We're not going to be doing dithering with this preset, so I want to make sure the DC filter is off and the type is set to none. Now, for the multiband harmonic exciter, I'm going to switch to the warm preset, which I determined earlier I like the sound of, and also go to the mid-side mode. And on the side band, just add a little bit of this to band 4. I'll also start with this bypassed because this effect is not always needed. For the multiband dynamics, I'm going to create a fairly typical setup where I bring the threshold in and put in a 11:1 ratio, and then on the compressor, you'll see the threshold, I'll just put it in down. I'm just setting this up graphically because I have to adjust these to suit. I'm putting the second point here with a ratio of 2 to 1 a little bit below that. Now I can copy this to the other bands, and that'll give me a starting point for the working with the multi-band dynamics. The actual crossover frequencies, I'll be adjusting these based on the music that's playing at the time, so I think this is good enough for the multi-band dynamics. Now for the stereo imaging, one of the things that I like to do is in the low band, move this to mono. So I'm going to move the lowest band to mono, and I'm also going to leave the other bands doing nothing. If I want to add widening to the bands, then I would add that in as the song needs it. With that, I think I've got a pretty good starting point for mastering. I'm going to go back to my preset and click Update. And so now I've saved all the changes to this. Now I want to go back and create another preset for dithering. First, I'll disable all the modules and go into the loudness maximizer module and turn on the DC offset, turn on the in-bit plus dithering, high noise shaping, 16-bit bit depth, which would be typical for dithering amount normal, which is a good starting point, and will also enable limit peaks. And with that, we've got a good dithering preset. I'll go back to presets in my presets here, and now I'm going to add this as the Groove 3 dithering. And so now I've got my two good starting points for the mastering project. Now, you'll want to tailor these to your own taste, the style of music, but you'll also find that this will speed up the work you're doing. Even if you find presets that you like as a starting point among the presets that are shipped, it's a good idea to adjust those based on your preference and your experience as you get going with Ozone and save them in a way that you can find them later. Another good thing to do is to save them for the project that you're working on, just in case you have to come back to it at a later date or you want to do something similar in that style. It's nice to have a note or a preset saved that gives you an idea of what you did on that particular project. Well, that's the starting point for some presets for our project. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show examples of how to create macro faders to go along with your presets. Macro faders are the little faders that pop up next to a preset and allow you to adjust a few of the settings right at the top level. So to get started, we're going to start with the Groove 3 mastering setup that we created in a previous video. Now, to get into the mode where we can add macro faders, we need to undock the preset manager. So I click undock here, and now it's in its own separate window. So we're going to start with the loudness maximizer, and we're going to create a top level copy of this control right here. So the way we do that is click on Advanced in the Preset Manager, add a macro fader, and I'll just call it louder, because as we turn it up, we want it to get louder or seem louder. Now let's go into the options here. We can put several parameters onto this macro fader, but we're going to put just one for this example. So go into the maximizer, and it's the threshold. Now the threshold goes from -20 to 0, so it starts at -20 and goes to 0. And we're going to accept this scale for our fader of 0 to 100, where 100 is the max, and then set the default. Now, let's just go ahead and take a look. Our macro fader is right here. Now, when it came up, it's set to 50, and as I move it, you'll see that I have to go up to 100%. We really want it to start all the way up. So let's just change this to 100. So that's now the default. So when I come into my preset, if I save it this way, it will start all the way up. Now let's move on to a little bit more complicated example. I'm going to go into the multiband dynamics. One of the things that I like to do that's not directly possible in Ozone is to adjust the threshold for the limiter across all the bands all at once. But with the presets and a macro fader, we can easily set that up to do that. So I'm going to create another macro fader, and this one is going to be for the So it's for the limiter threshold. So now we already have the fader appears up here. We're going to want to start with the threshold all the way up. So I'm going to put in 100. Now I need to find the actual parameters in the limiter. So we go in here into dynamics, and now I want to look for the first band for the limiter. Now these are for the limiter mid-band and sideband. We don't want to accidentally pick those up. We want the limiter threshold band 1. So there's that. Now, to make this a little more interesting, I'm going to add the other bands so that I can set them all together with this one fader. So I'm going to go back into dynamics, find the next band for the limiter. Here's the limiter threshold band 2, and I'm going to add that in. And I'm actually going to go down and do that for all the bands. All right, so now I have them all in here. Let's test how this works. So we'll move this down a little bit so we can see what's happening. I'm going to move the limiter threshold. You can see it's working for band 1. If you build these, you definitely have to test them to see if they're working. So that's band 1, band 2, band 3. When I go to full scale, it's at 0. Now, down in this range, it's really not useful, so I might want to put a little bit of a limit on how far down I'm going to allow this to go. So maybe I'll allow it to go down to 30 rather than minus 130. So I'm going to change this to minus 30 in this column for the starting point. So now that we have our limiter threshold in there, I'm going to go out of advanced, go back to my preset here, and now we'll test the limiter threshold, and this should go all the way up, and then it goes down to 30. So that's how we can create a useful range on a preset like this. And that's really just an example. We could allow that to go down further if we wanted, but I wanted to leave a little room there because I'm going to do the very same thing with the compressor. And this will allow me to get a nice setup for the compressor. So I'm going to go through and actually set the compressor up almost the same way. So I'll add the next macro fader. I've already got the louder, the threshold limiter, and now I'm going to put the compressor threshold setting in here. We'll use the same scale here. And now all we need to do is go into dynamics, find the bands for the compressor band threshold 1, band 2 compressor threshold, band 3 compressor threshold, and band 4 compressor threshold. I'm also going to set the default here. It's going to be a little bit different, but we're going to see where we need to set the default. Since the current default is set at maybe 70 or 80% of full scale, I'm going to set this to 80, and we'll see how that looks. So if this is set to 80, and then thinking about this, maybe I'll set this to 90, 85. It takes a little experimentation to find the perfect amount for these. So I just want to get, just a good starting point for these settings. So I'll go with 70 for this one. And this is really, with a scale of 0 to 100, this range is really in percentage. But you could use any scale that you want. We could go from 1 to 10 or some other scale if we want it, but it's really just to give you a way to set these all together. So you can see now across all the bands at the same time, if I go to any of these bands, I can adjust these 2 points and they'll all change together. Now, I'm not saying that you normally are going to want to do that, but that is very helpful as you're getting your very initial setup going. So I'm going to click OK on this and go back to the preset manager. Just go out of advanced mode. Since I did a lot of work to set these up, I'm going to click Update at this point. So now I've got louder and I've got my 2 limiter thresholds. And if I wanted, I could add more, like I could add the reverb amount or the reverb room size or things like that. But I think this is all I really want on this setup. You can take this as some inspiration to create your own macro faders. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to use everything that we've learned about Ozone throughout the course of these videos and apply it to a mastering project. Now, the real stars here are the artists who have kindly provided permission to use their songs. Producer Scott Fritz has provided Bombing the Fire by Cavalier King, Fool's Fantasy by Martha Berner, and also Marry Him by the Hawthorne Effect. Great tunes. We've really loved working with those. Actually, I've added the Marry Him by the Hawthorne Effect as a new introduction into this final project because I wanted to bring in something that was different material we haven't heard before and also add it to this. And also, Johnny Gieb provided his tunes, Breakdown and But I'm Alive. Johnny's a singer-songwriter who is also a recording enthusiast and has produced these tunes that we've also incorporated. Now, I thought it was great to bring in different artists. We've got 4 different singers here. We've got different production environments, things that were produced at different times. And that is probably the most challenging kind of mastering. Now, what I'm going to do is go through and just show you a few of the decisions I've made. Now, a lot of the things I've done here, I've done for examples about Ozone features. And of course, the way you do mastering is going to really depend on the style of music you do and your own approach. There are many, many approaches to mastering. Through this, we've learned what Ozone has to offer, and I think that you should have picked up how flexible it is in this kind of situation. So let's start right in the beginning with Bombing the Fire. I'll play back some of the song, then we'll go into Ozone and see how it's set up. Now this is a great tune. It's very well mixed, so it makes the mastering quite easy. But what we've done with Bombing the Fire is we compared it to a hit pop song. And as you saw before, when we did that comparison, we found it was already quite in line with that. I'm just going to walk through exactly how that's done. We took a snapshot of the song, which is shown right here, and then we took a snapshot of the hit song and set that to target. And then back over here, now we can actually see superimposed the 2 curves, at least in this example. Maybe there's a slight difference in the way the mid-range is set up, but it's actually very subtle. Nonetheless, we use matching EQ as an example here, and on the matching EQ in the snapshots, we can coax our EQ to push it in the direction of our reference track, and that's what we've done right here. The other thing is we've got superimposed here the 6 dB per roll-off curve and also the pink curve, which you can see right here, the pink guide, which is in pink. And those also give you a little bit of visual reference if you're on the right track for the mastering. Now, for playback purposes here, I just went into the options and changed on the options spectrum the average time here to 5 seconds. That will slow down the updating of the spectrum and give you a better visual reference to our other references. So let me play back again. I'll show you that.
Me in Mexico, riding on my rocket, we need oxygen and ethanol. I'm an outsider, seeker and a finder. Got a little cut, I'm gonna open it up wider. Already we're closer, want it on a poster. You look a little feverish, so take another dose because the
Also, the other thing that I did there was I reduced this influence of the matching EQ. The matching EQ is a digital EQ and it's got like 8,000 bands, and it can be pretty aggressive when you're using the matching EQ. So I've reduced that amount quite a bit, and then the smoothing works quite well in this range here. So that's how the EQ is set up. It's actually set up quite subtle. And then let's just move on. For the mastering reverb, I've chose to leave it off on this track. The track does not need to be cluttered with additional reverberance, though we will use it on some of the other tracks. Now, the all-important loudness maximizing, as we play back, one thing we have to make sure is ditherings off on every one of these. One of the important things with mastering is quality control. You really don't want to make a lot of mistakes, so you do want to check through all of the tracks and all these settings numerous times or against a checklist just to make sure you don't have something goofy going on in your track, because this is it. Once you burn CDs, there is no going back from there. So one of the things that I've decided, we have the option to mix to the K system or to mix with peak average meters. So I'm using the peak average meters, but I'm using -12 as sort of my reference point. Of course, I'm also listening track to track to make sure that they match, also to make sure the characteristics of the lead vocal match. But for the overall volume, we're targeting around here. If we were on K14, for instance, in the K system, we'd be targeting a little bit lower. The other thing you'll find is if you reference hit released material, it's going to trend much higher. Like our reference song here actually has an average RMS somewhere around -6, which leaves you very little headroom for peaks. Now, let me just play back. You can see where the loudness maximizer is set up.
Battle we are fighting, and the reason why I wanna cut you out of all the lies that we're running out of time. Finding the fire, you can change your life. Follow desire, I will rock your world. Finding the fire, you can change your life.
I think I wake up every morning with this tune in my head since I started this project. All right, moving on to the multiband harmonic exciter. Really on the mid channel, we've got nothing going on, and there's a little bit mixed in here. And I'm not sure that this is really necessary, but I've added it just for slight clarity.
Show me you're rockin'. I'll show you the stuff.
I think this is entirely optional on this song. So in retrospect, now I'm listening on headphones, so this isn't a good critical listening environment, but I'm going to bypass the multiband harmonic exciter. With the way the vocal effects are going, there's a lot of harmonic content in the song. I don't think that needs any help. Now, the way I'm using the multiband dynamics in this song and in the others is as a pre-compressor for loudness maximizing. You can also use it for EQ, and we've done a little bit of that in some of these songs by adjusting the band gains. But really, I'm just controlling it just slightly to hold the tightness together before it hits the loudness maximizer. So I think that hitting a couple of stages of limiting is better than hitting a single stage really hard. So we want to share the work here between the multiband dynamics and the loudness maximizer in most cases, and that's sort of the way that I approach this. Let's take a look at the stereo imaging. The stereo imaging, I've used this technique of reducing the bandwidth in the lowest band to take it to mono. I've got slight widening on here just because of the nature of this song, it could handle it. I've also found that dramatic changes in these bands just don't really sound that good, at least not on this tune. So I've got a touch of that in there, and we'll play back a little bit more, and then we'll move on to the next song.
It's over, nothing gonna hold ya. Don't believe the hate that everybody else has told ya. Stars like snow.
All right, so that's Bombing the Fire. Now let's move on to Martha Berner's song. Martha Berner is a singer-songwriter, and her kind of rock or alternative rock, folk rock kind of sound is really quite contrast to the more dance electronic nature of Bombing the Fire. So let's listen here.
Oh, what a thing to say. I would shoot the moon, but my gambles never pay. I would take my time and walk this world with a friend of mine. Walk this world. And the water tastes like wine.
The great thing about this recording is it's exceptionally well recorded. You can hear every detail. The vocal is very intimate, the bass is really strong, and there's great clarity in that entire mix. So it's a great mix and it's a great balanced tune. I was playing around with a few things to see, but when I looked at the reference to this, when the song gets going, it matches the reference quite nicely. So ultimately, I didn't do anything more there. Now the mastering reverb is added just to give a little bit of a tie together of the overall mix, and also to match it with the Hawthorne Effect song where I added a little bit of this in as well. So let me play back and I'll solo the reverb. You can hear what we've done here.
Won't you be my widow? Won't you It's the perfect day, perfect day, perfect day for me. And
All right, so that's all we've done with that. It just a slight little finishing to the mix. Now let's just take a look at the loudness maximizer. It's set up about the same, and let's just take a look at the metering as I play back.
our battles, they will write about years to come.
Now in the multiband harmonic exciter, we determined this during one of the other videos that we could add just a little bit of interest to this song by going into the mid-side mode and add just a little bit of this excitement using the warm setting just to the side channel, which picks up kind of the guitars or the drums a little bit. And on the mid channel, there's none of this. So we've left this on this song. Multiband dynamics is also set up in pre-processing, loudness maximizing. And if you look at all the bands, they're set up very, very similarly to each other, but these were just all tweaked just to make sure that we're touching the peaks as the song plays back. We're not adding any gain here, but we're controlling the peaks. We're also pre-compressing very slightly. You'll see that the compressor ratio here is about 1.5 on most of these. Here's 1.8. These are sort of tweaked by ear. A little bit more compression on the low end to control the bass. The bass sounds great on this. And then on the stereo imaging, we have absolutely nothing going on here, so we can also deactivate this module. We could also deactivate the parametric equalizer if we want to just keep it clean. So rather than trying to add something where there's really nothing going on, I'm also going to deactivate that as well. So with that, we've finished the first two songs, and we're going to do the three remaining songs in part 2 of this video. I'll see you in the next video. Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue with our final mastering project with the three remaining songs. So now, let's move on to Johnny Gieb's first song here. This is Breakdown.
You said I got something important to tell you. Prepare for a heartbreak, a mile wide. You didn't know how I was going to take it.
All right, so let's take a look at this. This kind of song, which is more of a dense rock song that has the crunchy guitars that are double tracked in the stereo spectrum, along with that type of lead vocal, it's a little bit of a challenge to make sure you've got intelligibility in the vocal. So in the EQ, what we've done here is using one of the EQs, I've wound up using the analog EQ just after trying different things, is on the side channel, I took a little dip in the mid-range, or kind of the upper mid-range, after playing around looking for the frequency of the crunch guitars to take them down a little bit. While this is a great sounding mix, I thought the vocal was not up front as much as it was on the other songs. So standing on its own, it sounds pretty good. But compared to the other songs, the vocal's back a little bit. So one of the challenges in the mastering was to bring that up a little bit. So my first step was to take out a little bit here, very, very mild amount. You can see this is like under 2 dB of change. I took out a little bit on the sideband. And the midband here, again, in this particular case, I didn't feel like I needed to add any EQ. Looking at the loudness maximizer, this is set up and tweaked about the same as the other songs. Now, the harmonic exciter really came into play as I was auditioning between all the other songs. I found that the warm setting that we identified earlier worked very well in bringing the intelligibility of the vocal forward. And the nice thing about using the maximizer for this is it does it without adding a lot of energy. And we can really kind of key in on the area you want. Now, the problem with this is it starts unnatural or nasally if you get too aggressive with it. So I'm going to play back and show you the effect of this. I'll play around with these bands a little bit, also bypass it so you can hear the difference.
But that didn't stop you throwing that knife. You said you'd found someone new, but there was a one left to do. You said you had to break down. Tell me then. You said you had to break down. Tell me goodbye. You didn't want to hang out and watch.
I've also used mid-side processing for this, so I'm only doing this in the mid-band where predominantly the lead vocal and the bass and the kick drum reside in that area. Great feature I've really enjoyed with Ozone 4. Now in the multiband dynamics, again, we're doing a little pre-processing. I brought the level of this song up slightly at this stage, adding 4 dB of gain on most of these bands, maybe a little bit more. So we're also doing a bit of EQ here. When you add gain inconsistently, like here, we've brought up slightly by a dB this band of frequencies, and then this band is brought up a little bit less. So we've put in a little bit of an EQ using the multiband dynamics. Otherwise, we're limiting in a very similar shape to the other songs. Then on the stereo imaging, I took advantage of the opportunity to reduce the bandwidth on the most lowest channel where you can't hear the difference anyway. This gives you a little tighter quality in the bass on playback, especially if you're on a larger system. So let's move on now to the next song.
On the long flashes fall to think I'll fall back for just a few 6 a.m. and I'm still.
All right, so in this one, you can see on the paragraphic equalizer, once again, in the mid band, I've taken a little bit out, and on the side band, I've taken more out. That looks like probably maybe a little too aggressive, but there is a specific thing that we're doing here. There is a cymbal crash that I felt was a little unbalanced in the mix, and so I was bringing that frequency down. And one of the nice things about doing that on the sideband, which is where it's a little bit more tendency toward the sideband, is that you can do that without actually taking a big chunk out of your lead line or your lead instruments. So that's what that EQ was for. Otherwise, the song nicely matches the reference, as you can see right here. On the mastering reverb, I did bring it in a little bit, and I believe I've also got this too much, so I'm going to reduce that back down. And on playback, I'll listen to that again. Let's see, the pre-delay is set. This is a slower song, so you can get away with a little bit more pre-delay. I'll have to check this on playback to make sure that. So when I play this back, I'm going to solo this reverb and just see if this is set up right.
Without you. All of these memories I can't erase. I'm alive.
All right, so the reason that that's up a little bit more is because that's on the side channel. This song has a very, very wide spread to it with the way that it's mixed. And so I was trying to tie that together and add a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of tie-in between that wide side sound and all the content in the middle. So that's the reason that's set that way. On the mid channel here, I think that there's no reason to have this probably on at all, because we don't want to mess with the clarity on this song because it sounds nice. I guess with a ballad, you know, if some of this stuff is It's really a matter of how it sounds on playback. So I'm going to try this again. The other thing we have to think about is we're making a compilation, so we need elements to tie all these unrelated tracks together. So this would be a tool to do that. All right, I'm going to go and continue on with those settings. Loudness maximizer is about the same. You know, when you look at the histogram here, the histogram gives you kind of it gives you a visual and it gives you support. You know, like you can bring the limit down, but you can't bring it into the body of where the loudness is trending in this song. So I'll play back a little bit and you'll see that I've still got the volume up around -12.
You're the one playing this deadly game. Just a few bumps, but he's still the same. A sentimental.
Now when we get to the chorus of the song, that's the verse, then you're going to hit your forte part and it'll be maybe slightly higher than 12. I also check that back and forth between the other songs like I said before. Otherwise these settings are just like the other songs. On the multiband harmonic exciter, similarly, in the mid-range here, in the mid-channel, I've done the same thing with Johnny's voice by adding these to suit. I've added a little bit of the warm algorithm to the band 2 and the band 3. One thing about these bands is that as you're setting them, you might use the learn mode, but you really have to also try moving them around when you're using these kinds of effects. And if you forgot how the learn mode works, then I'm just going to review that here.
Just to know your name, but I'm alive. What am I?
The other thing about this is, I know that this won't work quite right there, is that since I've got 2 songs by this artist, I might want to reference the other song, especially when I'm using this kind of effect. If I want to get a similar vocal quality, I might want to reference the cutoff frequencies or the crossover frequencies in the other song when I set this up. So that's how I've got the multiband harmonic exciter. Again, I'm using it to bring out the clarity and the intelligibility, actually bring up the lead vocal to match the other songs. Now in the multiband dynamics, this setup is very similar, as you'll see here on some sample bands. And then on the multiband stereo imaging, again, I'm cutting the stereo image or going to mono, folding it back to mono on the lowest channel down here. Now let's move on to our newest song, the Hawthorne effect. And one point here in an application note is that I'm continuing to use the shortcuts for moving to the markers using the extended keyboard. So I did .5 and when I do my final check here at the very end, I'm going to use that extensively to jump around a bit between the different songs and also using these markers here. So let's play this back.
Hello, Chicago, here we go again. Standing up in a funeral for a friend. It's all coming right back again. I know she don't want me.
Now on this one, because this song was again a completely new song, I used a little bit of matching EQ. So I took the snapshot of the song. This is the snapshot of our hit reference song. And you can see there is a little bit of a discrepancy, even though the mix sounds great. I applied a subtle trend towards our reference song using the snapshot and then using this amount. You can see I added 21% of that curve. A lot of this, in reality, with the referencing, a lot of times what I would actually do here is use the reference amount as a guide. So you can go to the reference, take a look at the curve that Ozone is giving you back, then clear this back to digital or analog, and then make your own curve peaked around these areas while you're just listening back. But for a good reference for the Ozone video, another way to do this is to trend it towards your reference material. In this case, I thought it worked quite nicely. Now the mastering reverb, I brought it back in. This setup is very similar to the Martha Burner song, which is maybe stylistically a little closer to this. And then the loudness maximizer, again, we're set. Also getting this song in an average volume range that's compatible with the other songs. On the harmonic exciter, I added just a little bit of interest here to the mid channel, and much the way I did with the Johnny Gibb song. But the Hawthorne effect, it sounded good, but I felt like it could use maybe a little help in this area too. And I did this by sound. And then dynamics, again, we're using this as a pre-compressor or pre-limiter before the loudness maximizer. And on the stereo imaging, I used the same bass mono effect in the lowest band. So with that, I've gone through all of the decisions I've made. Everything should be fairly well balanced at this point. So we're going to do one last example where I'm going to go into the body of the song. We're going to jump around between these a bit, and then we'll just see if there's any mismatches.
And the shadows of all of our battle. And the shadows.
I just sat back in total amazement. Not even one tear. Did I cry the replacement?
And the shadows of all.
You're the one playing this deadly game. Just a few bumps, but he's still the same. I sent him, don't wanna marry you. Hand in hand with
Now the thing I heard, there might be a slight volume mismatch with this one. There might be a tonality adjustment that could be made here. This sounds a little, I don't know, a little more hollow than when I compared it to Fool's Fantasy. It's really tough when you can't necessarily get that perfect on a compilation album, but you can then start listening to the transitions. Another part of mastering, of course, is to get the songs in the right order, to get the fade in, fade outs, and the gap between songs set exactly the way you want. And those are all things you could do with this setup. You'd have to make a note of them as you go into your authoring solution or your authoring tool, and then make sure that you've got that set up in there as well. So on the master fader in Ozone, we want to look at the loudness maximizer, verify everything else is off, check your dithering settings that they're set correctly and on 16-bit. When we're mastering, we probably want to save files as 24 bits as well, so you have undithered 24-bit masters as well as your 16-bit dithered masters. So that's just a tip, because you never know. A lot of your material might not be targeted towards CDs. Now we need to turn the instance of Ozone on with the dithering. During all the auditioning, everything else I did, I disabled dithering because we actually don't want to hear the dithering and hear it through that while we're doing all of our critical listening and adjustments. We want to put it on at the end when we're going to actually make these files. So then the final step is to take each song. As I click on the song, I've got my loop marker. We'll take Fool's Fantasy here as the example. We'll finally go to in Pro Tools in the menu, bounce to disk, and it comes up with this. And when we click, this setup looks good. When we click bounce, then Pro Tools will ask us for the location that we're going to save it. And since we're in Pro Tools, it will do that mix in real time, or it'll do that bounce in real time. So it will take another 4 minutes for that song to finish playing back. So now we're at the end of the series, and you should have a good understanding of Ozone and a pretty good idea of how to apply it to mastering your own projects. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video very soon.